Often the most dangerous manipulators are very eloquent and convincing. They are easily able to put the victim's vigilance to sleep, intimidate and completely subordinate it to their will. Relationships with such a person can carry a serious threat to both mental and physical health. As a rule, the manipulator is looking for a victim full of life, ambition, and energy of a person, so that in his network often fall even the most intelligent, strong, and independent who simply break, becoming obedient and uncomplaining puppets. Australian stalker from Tinder, as he was nicknamed in the press, hunting for young, successful beauties, which he first conquered with his charisma, intelligence, and appearance, and then turned their lives into a real nightmare. The man's name was Paul Lambert, and he was incredibly attractive, intelligent, seductive, and equally insane. He stalked his victims with manic persistence, tortured, intimidated, maimed, and prepared to kill. The only thing that stopped him was a bullet fired to kill. Early years of Paul Lambert's life. Paul Lambert, née Scales, was born in 1980 on the 10th of August in Brisbane, the largest city and capital of the state of Queensland, Australia. He was the youngest of two children in the family of Margaret and Oliver Scales, and was raised with his older sister, Dorothy. When the boy was not yet 5 years old, his parents divorced. His father left the family and practically stopped communicating with the heirs, although he helped his former wife financially. Soon the man remarried, and in his new marriage he had 2 more children, after which he began to visit Paul and Dorothy, only to congratulate him on his birthday or Christmas, and sometimes called them. The boy missed his father very much, and was very resentful of him for leaving and, as he thought, falling out of love with him and his sister. Already in junior high school, Paul began to have serious problems with behavior and discipline. He became almost uncontrollable and could not control him, neither mother nor teachers. The child behaved aggressively towards other children, did not recognize any authority, was impulsive, irritable, and his mood was constantly changing. Concerned, Margaret decided to show her son to a specialist and turned for help to a child psychologist, who diagnosed the boy with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. However, the doctor at that time did not see it as anything terrible, concluding that the problem arose against the background of divorce of parents, and with time, will pass by itself. Allegedly, Paul experienced his father's departure too painfully, which resulted in behavioral problems and difficulties with concentration. A psychologist at the time didn't prescribe any medication for the child, believing he would soon outgrow his neurological behavioral disorder. However, as time passed, the situation only worsened. By the age of 10, the boy became uncontrollable, displaying aggression and unpredictability. His mother decided to seek help again, this time consulting a psychiatrist who not only diagnosed him with ADHD, but also identified several other mental health issues, including bipolar disorder and clear signs of dissociative identity disorder, DID. Commonly known as multiple personality disorder, this condition means the patient's identity is fragmented, leading to the impression that multiple distinct personalities exist within one individual. The boy was prescribed receptor medications, which he was supposed to take under his mother's strict supervision. However, getting him to comply was nearly impossible. He actively avoided taking his medication, convinced he was healthy and had no issues. Nonetheless, while Paul was a child, managing him was easier. Margaret insisted on treatment that seemed to help, and for several years, the problem was forgotten. Paul's mental health struggles did not affect his intelligence or academic abilities. He excelled in school, becoming the top student. He had a knack for the sciences, easily performing complex calculations in his head, and his teachers believed he would succeed in a scientific career. After graduating, he effortlessly enrolled in a prestigious Australian university, earning a master's degree in economics and finance. Upon graduation, he secured a position at the headquarters of a major company in Sydney, quickly rising to lead the finance department. In terms of relationships, Paul had a striking appearance from a young age, and it only became more captivating over time. With masculine features, large expressive eyes, and a strong physique, he made a great first impression. He had many admirers in school, eager to catch his attention. Paul was sociable, easily making friends and often being the life of the party. His mental health issues produced an interesting side effect: a powerful charisma. Everyone considered him a good guy, reliable and respected by his colleagues. When a child of one of his co-workers was diagnosed with cancer, he personally initiated a fundraising effort, providing significant support to the family. As mentioned earlier, Paul was good at making friends and easily started relationships with girls, but they were always short-lived. Before long, he would reveal his true nature, scaring his partners away. His romances typically lasted only a few months, after which he would turn their lives into a nightmare, stalking them, threatening them, lying, manipulating their emotions, and instilling fear. This was just the tip of the iceberg. Notably, he always chose very attractive girls who matched his own model-like appearance. Paul had several favorite methods for manipulating his victims to keep them close. He was highly articulate and persuasive, constantly playing on their sympathy by fabricating terminal illnesses for himself and his loved ones, which made the girls feel guilty for leaving their sick boyfriend. Only his mother and sister truly understood what Paul was really like. While he was a child or a teenager, he was difficult but manageable. His mother insisted on therapy, but as an adult, he completely rejected treatment and psychiatric visits. He achieved his goals through blackmail and threats, with the most effective method being the threat of suicide. Between 2002 and 2016, 6 restraining orders were issued against Paul, forbidding him from contacting or approaching 6 different girlfriends from that period. He stalked each victim for an extended time, poisoning their lives and driving them to the brink of madness. For one of them, he even emigrated to another continent, but was deported and banned from entering the country after she reported him to the police. But let's go through this step by step. First, love. While attending university, Paul met a girl named Samantha. They began a romantic relationship, but it didn't last long. He tried to control her every move, manipulating her, pressuring her, stalking her, and completely stripping her of the ability to make her own decisions. It all came to an end after graduation when Samantha stayed in Queensland while Paul, driven by career ambitions, moved to Sydney. Despite the turmoil in their relationship, they continued to stay in touch after their breakup. At the start of their romance, they were both young, and for each of them, it was their first love. Perhaps that's why Samantha hesitated to completely sever their ties. The former couple occasionally called each other, exchanged messages, and interacted on social media. Samantha had no idea about Paul's new relationships. He regularly texted her saying he missed her, couldn't forget her, and hadn't met anyone better. This was, of course, a manipulation. But despite her previous experiences with him, Samantha believed he had changed for the better over the years apart, and that he truly loved her. Attempt to start a family. In January 2014, nearly 10 years after their breakup, the couple rekindled their relationship. Just a month later, Paul proposed, and Samantha happily accepted. They got married on March 2nd of that year. However, the new husband's behavior became troubling just a few weeks into their marriage. Paul began losing control, unable to manage his emotions, and even the smallest things could set him off. He constantly exerted emotional pressure on Samantha, trying to dominate her will. When that didn't work, he resorted to physical violence. When Samantha attempted to leave her tyrant husband, he promised to see a specialist and undergo treatment. She believed him, but it turned out to be just another manipulation tactic. 6 months after their wedding, when tensions reached a breaking point, Samantha brought up the idea of divorce again. This time, Paul promised once more to seek help, but she no longer trusted him. He then suggested they take a trip together to sort out their feelings and think things over. Surprisingly, this idea seemed like a possible solution to Samantha, and she agreed to start planning the trip. In late September 2014, the couple traveled to the other side of the world, to the United States. Paul insisted on visiting Florida, a place he had long wanted to see. Although Samantha preferred Hawaii, she caved under the pressure from her manipulative husband, who always got his way. They renewed their wedding vows on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. However, despite the romantic setting, the event and the trip could not save their marriage. Hunting in Florida. After returning to Australia, Paul insisted they move to Florida, where he had enjoyed his time. Samantha was adamantly against it. She had no intention of relocating to another country or continuing their relationship. Samantha insisted on a divorce, but Paul had no intention of granting it. During this time, he became obsessed with the idea of moving to the U.S., pushing everything else aside. He simply abandoned Samantha, quit his well-paying job, packed his things, and flew to Florida. The girl continued to seek an official divorce, but her husband ignored her efforts. Thanks to his solid savings from years at a big company, Paul was able to indulge himself after relocating to a new country. He rented a spacious apartment in a nice area, regularly hit the gym, bought expensive trendy clothes, and carefully maintained his appearance. Wherever he went, he drew the attention of women, but he was on the hunt for something special: the unfinished divorce. Paul created profiles on several dating sites, showcasing his best photos. Almost immediately, numerous women began messaging him, admiring his looks, and eager to get to know him better. However, he took his time responding until he stumbled upon the profile of Britney Ann Kill. This 32-year-old blonde was a local news anchor with a truly Hollywood appearance. Britney caught Paul's attention right away, and he was the first to message her, suggesting they meet up. Without hesitation, she agreed, and they set a date just a day later. Paul charmed her with his charisma, eloquence, and good looks. He didn't just shower her with compliments. He took Britney to one of the city's best restaurants. Paul made an unforgettable impression on her, so much so that she found herself falling for him on their first date. Britney thought he was the man of her dreams, possessing all the best qualities, and she excitedly shared this with her best friend. However, Paul viewed her as a prized trophy, something he needed to boost his own ego. This woman was incredibly beautiful, a popular TV personality, and had immense career potential. Paul didn't want to lose her, so he made up some important business to justify flying back to Australia to finalize his divorce. He planned to return to the States right after and propose to Britney. Samantha was taken aback by Paul's sudden visit, and even more shocked by his frantic desire to end their marriage, especially since he had previously refused to grant her a divorce. Nevertheless, by early 2015, without an official dissolution of their marriage, Paul flew back to Florida, unable to endure the separation from his new obsession. More accurately, he couldn't bear leaving her without his watchful eye. When Britney accidentally discovered the real reason Paul had gone to Australia, she was shocked and even considered breaking up with him, feeling guilty for the collapse of his marriage. However, Paul managed to convince her that he and his wife had long since separated and that they had mutually decided to end their marriage. He just needed to settle some formalities. Upon his return, Paul immediately went to see Britney, spinning a sob story about his unhappy first marriage and his search for true love. His words sounded so sincere that just a week later, the couple moved in together. However, Britney laid down some ground rules, agreeing to give Paul a sort of trial period of 3 months. She believed that during this time they could see if they were truly compatible. Beauty and the Beast. After moving in, it took Paul just a month to reveal his true self and turn Britney's life into a nightmare. He began to see her as his possession, believing he had the right to dictate her actions and completely control her life. His behavior became erratic, and his actions were unpredictable. It seemed he was battling multiple conflicting personalities within himself, which he couldn't control. Britney quickly realized that something was seriously wrong with her new partner and tried to end the relationship. For Paul, this was a call to action. He started blaming her, claiming that he had divorced his wife and flown halfway around the world for her. He insisted he had sacrificed everything for her, and she was now destroying his life. He pushed for them to stick to their original plan of living together for at least 3 months, but Britney packed her things and moved out to another apartment. Trying to escape her unstable boyfriend by moving didn't work. Paul began stalking Britney, not leaving her alone for a moment. He sent her hundreds of messages daily, called from different numbers, emailed her, and literally followed her everywhere. The tone of his messages fluctuated between love declarations and pleas for forgiveness to threats of self-harm or harm against her. A couple of weeks later, Paul changed tactics. He called Britney, his voice trembling, and told her that his father had died and he had no one to talk to in the U.S. Britney's heart softened. She couldn't imagine anyone lying about something so serious. Being kind-hearted and empathetic, she agreed to meet her ex-boyfriend, genuinely wanting to support him, believing he needed to talk and vent. So, playing on her sympathy and manipulating her feelings, Paul managed to maintain a connection with Britney for a while, making it seem like they were back together. However, he couldn't keep himself together. He became aggressive again, acting erratically and frightening her. When Britney attempted to break up with him once more, he declared that he wouldn't survive another shock and threatened to harm himself. Britney was frankly afraid of her inadequate boyfriend, but didn't know how to get rid of him. She gently suggested that he seek help from a psychiatrist, to which Paul replied that psychotherapy and medication will not help him because he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, which is growing and is the cause of his breakdowns as well as strange behavior. The pathological liar cried, claiming he was going to die soon, and made the girlfriend promise that she wouldn't leave him while he was alive. The next month and a half turned out to be the most terrible in the life of the popular TV host, because Paul did not give her peace neither at home nor at work. The girl stopped sleeping normally, became anxious, distracted. She had panic attacks, which negatively affected her work and threatened to turn into a complete collapse of her career. Restraining order and deportation. Unable to cope, Britney simply ran away from Scales, staying with a friend where she thought he wouldn't bother her. But the man changed tactics and began to threaten the girl with the publication of her candid photos, as well as an intimate video, which he filmed without her knowledge. This was the last straw, and the victim finally went to the police, which she also reported to her stalker. In July 2015, the court issued an order prohibiting the stalker from approaching the girl or having any contact with her in any way. But despite this, Paul continued to stalk his victim, writing her threats, blackmailing her, following her. In October of the same year, the man was finally deported from the country, banning him from entering the United States, and Kill was able to breathe a sigh of relief. Back in Australia, Scales, first of all, changed his name to Lambert, his mother's maiden name, so that no one would know about his problems with the law, and then he decided to return his ex-wife, with whom he never had time to divorce. Samantha was horrified to learn of Paul's return and went to the police to ask them to protect her and speed up the process of dissolution of the marriage. First, attempted murder. In February 2016, Paul called his wife and told her that he agreed to give her a divorce, and after convincing her to go to a lawyer together to settle some nuances. Samantha, despite the fact that she knew this dangerous man well, believed him, and was already anticipating how she would receive the long-awaited certificate of divorce. The man picked up the girl in his car, and at first everything went normally. But as soon as they drove away from her house, he first began to beg to give up the divorce and live together again, and, having received a confident refusal, began to insult Samantha and threatened that he would smash the car so that they died together. Paul accelerated the car to a huge speed and almost flew under the truck, moving on the oncoming lane. The girl managed to twist the steering wheel and they drove off the road. Then the man began to beat his wife, but she managed to run out of the cabin and began to call for help. After the incident, Samantha went to court, accusing Paul of kidnapping, bodily harm, and attempted murder. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 10 months in prison, as well as promptly dissolved the marriage and forbidden to approach his ex-wife. Surprisingly, just a month later, the man was released on parole with a probationary period of 1 year. Once free, Paul went to another state, rented a house there, and got a job, but did not notify the authorities. However, every time, in order to check in with the inspector, he flew to the same place, so that no one guessed anything. By the way, Lambert was obliged to visit a psychiatrist, who found him to have much deeper problems than previously thought. He was prescribed medication, which he, of course, did not take. After attending the number of sessions prescribed by the court, the man refused the specialist's help. A new victim. Almost immediately after his release, Paul started a new profile on a dating site where he soon noticed 28-year-old Angela J., who fascinated him with her attractive, one could say, angelic appearance. It was his type, a graceful, blue-eyed blonde with a dazzling smile and an impeccable figure. The girl worked as a doctor and not so long ago went through a difficult divorce, so she was looking for support and understanding and found a man who almost took her life. However, everything began beautifully and romantically. Paul again turned on all his charm so that the new victim fell into his net. He showered Angela with compliments, took her on dates, seemed attentive, understanding, and sympathetic. After about a month, Lambert's behavior began to change rapidly. He became more and more obsessive and literally followed the girl. Secretly, he made a duplicate key to her house and would come there while Jay was at work. When she guessed about his visits, she decided to break off the relationship, and then, as you can guess, the worst began. Paul first begged her to forgive him and give him another chance. Then he threatened to take his own life, and when he realized it wasn't working, he started threatening Angela. Eventually, he asked her for help as a doctor, and she couldn't refuse. The girl promised that she would help him find a good specialist, and she herself would monitor the course of treatment, which the man seemed quite satisfied. Lambert behaved more and more inadequately and threateningly. He stole Jay's documents and refused to give them back to her, insisting that she go with him. But the girl realized how dangerous it was, and therefore did not make a mistake. She managed to call her sister, who called the police. Paul returned the documents but was given a warning, and then was simply released. Cut him up and tried to burn him alive. That same day, straight from the police station, Paul went to a hardware store where he bought a large kitchen knife, a roll of duct tape, and lighter fluid. Then he rented an inconspicuous car and drove to Angela's house, but he couldn't get in because the girl had changed the locks. He waited for her return from work, lurking near the front door. The girl saw her stalker at the last moment, managed to run into the house, close herself, and called the police. The law enforcers who arrived failed to apprehend Paul because he had escaped by that time. However, he returned a week later, on November 3rd, taking with him a crowbar, which he used to open the back door, and broke into Jay's home while she was at work. When the unsuspecting girl returned, she had barely had time to cross the threshold before she felt a stabbing pain in her shoulder. Angela tried to run, but Paul knocked her down and began stabbing her indiscriminately all over her body. She received more than a dozen stab wounds in the chest and neck area. Her arms were shredded, but the girl continued to fight for her life. Suddenly, the man took out a bottle of lighter fluid and doused the victim, and then took a lighter, which fortunately turned out to be faulty. All the while, Jay continued to scream and call for help. Her desperate cries were overheard by a neighbor who was passing by the house, and he bravely rushed to the rescue, armed with the first stick he could find. He managed to scare off the attacker, who ran away. The man immediately called an ambulance and clamped the bleeding wounds of the girl until the arrival of the medics. Shot like a rabid animal. Despite extensive injuries and heavy blood loss, the victim was saved. Surprisingly, Paul continued to write and call on Angela's phone, even when she was taken to the hospital. He apologized, blamed everything on his alter ego, and promised to get even. The man sent similar messages to his mother, as well as his ex-wife and Jay's parents. On November 4, Lambert called the police and spent several minutes talking about the personalities living inside him, accusing them of all the atrocities. To offers to surrender, he replied that he would rather die, and hung up. However, the police managed to trace the call, and they went on the trail of the criminal. Paul was caught the next morning on a highway off the east coast of Australia and ordered to stop, but he tried to get away from the patrol cars at breakneck speed. Spikes were placed on the road, thanks to which the fugitive's car was stopped. However, Lambert was not going to give up and jumped out, waving a huge knife. To all entreaties to surrender, the man again replied that he would rather die. He behaved aggressively and inadequately, ready to attack the officers who already had him in their sights. At one point, Paul swung a knife and ran at one of the police officers, who was forced to shoot, but one bullet did not stop the intruder. Then several more shots rang out, after which Lambert fell to the pavement and did not move again. Only death could stop the madman. Every seventh crime on Earth happens within families, and over 38% of these are committed by men. Moreover, domestic violence is most prevalent in developed countries. Approximately 33–50% of all women who die violent deaths are killed by their husbands or partners, highlighting the critical need to protect women from domestic crimes. But why does a woman's desire for a strong man by her side sometimes lead her straight into the hands of a monster? Maybe it's because some are willing to have that strong shoulder at any cost. After all, society and family teach us that a woman needs a man by her side. We are raised that way. And then, some women end up enduring violence. This happened in 2012. Katarina Gurova was just 26 years old, and her killer is already out of prison and back in Ijevsk. Let's dive into a new story. Ijevsk is a large industrial city in the Russian Federation and is a scientific, educational, and cultural center of the Volga region. Located west of the Ural Mountains, this capital of Udmurtia is renowned for its weapons manufacturing and engineering industries. When visiting, one can admire the city's architecture, experience Udmurt culture, and explore the famous Izhmash Museum. Back in her hometown, Katarina Gurova's life wasn't going great. She had gone through a tough divorce, had no prospects, and was raising a young child alone. Feeling drained and defeated, she decided to start over. She moved with her daughter from Naberezhnya Chelny to Ijevsk, a new city, new experiences, new people. The change brought color back into her life. Ekaterina found work she loved, established herself in the beauty industry, and even had plans to open her own salon. Things were going well, except her personal life wasn't coming together. Despite her striking looks and constant attention from men, Ekaterina wasn't in a hurry to trust anyone. She avoided dating and threw herself into her work, until Alexei Tatarkin appeared in her life. They first met in 2007. Alexei worked as a taxi driver. Being noticed by such an attractive woman as Katya was flattering for him, so he turned up the charm. He told Ekaterina that driving a taxi was just a side gig and that by day he was a system administrator for several major companies, with 2 degrees in system administration and economics. By this time, Ekaterina was standing on her own 2 feet and didn't need financial support, but the fact that he was educated and seemed ambitious intrigued her. For a while, they kept things strictly friendly. Then, when her ex-husband's business needed a system administrator, Ekaterina thought of Alexei. He got the job, and from that moment, Alexei started to be more involved in her life, driving her and her child to daycare, fixing her computer, walking her dog, and even taking her to visit her parents back in Naberezhnya Chelny. But even with all this attention from Alexei, Katya saw it as just a friend helping out. So, he decided to change his tactics to win her heart. He began to play on her sympathy. One day, Alexei put on quite a show outside the office where Ekaterina worked. He was in tears, telling her he'd caught his wife with another man, and that his wife's aunt had even told him that the kids he thought were his weren't. Even though the whole scene seemed pretty ridiculous, Katya felt empathy for him and offered her support. Alexei kept pulling the sympathy card, claiming that he'd served in Chechnya, was wounded in the head there, and that sometimes he'd go to the funerals of his fallen comrades. The hardships of his life touched something in Ekaterina's heart, and she couldn't just leave him alone. But he finally won her over when he went to Moscow for surgery to remove a bullet supposedly lodged in his head. Alexei called her from the train station, saying he had passed out, and someone had stolen his money and documents. The compassionate Katya rushed to help him, brought him home, and took care of him for an entire week. It was after this incident that they started dating. Unfortunately, only a fraction of what Alexei had told her was true. The rest was a complete fabrication, but at the time, Ekaterina, smitten and unaware, couldn't see through the lies. Relationships built on deception rarely have a future, and problems in their relationship began almost immediately. Once, Alexei took the last 1,000 rubles from Ekaterina's purse just to buy her roses. He didn't seem to care that she was left with no money to even buy food for herself and her child. As time went on, Alexei started persuading Katya to move in together, and after much persistence, she finally agreed. But another surprise awaited her. Alexei suggested they get married. He applied to the registry office 3 times, but Katarina kept refusing. Once again, he resorted to dramatic gestures. Alexei Tatarkin would twist his arms in despair, saying he had no one else in the world, and if she turned him down again, he'd end his life. Katarina finally gave in, and on August 30th, 2011, their marriage was officially registered. Katarina's mother didn't like Alexei from the start. She found him unreliable and felt he wasn't a good match for her daughter. Several times over the phone, she even asked him not to pressure Katya if she wasn't ready to get married. But then one day, she got a call from her daughter. "Mom, I don't know how to say this. We got married." She tried to lighten the mood by joking, "Maybe getting divorced the second time won't be as scary as the first." After the wedding, their life together didn't get any better. They kept arguing about money. Just 2 months after they were married, Alexei Tatarkin started getting heavily involved in Katarina's business affairs. He sold the Kamaz trucks she got as part of the property division from her first marriage. With the money, they took a trip to Moscow and bought 3 used foreign cars to fix up and resell later. But in the end, they only got paid for 2 of the cars, and the money for the third seemed to vanish into thin air. Alexei insisted that he'd been scammed, but Katarina wasn't buying it anymore. She demanded that he either return the money or give her a car of equal value. Eventually, he wrote her a promissory note for 400,000 rubles, which Katya took to her mother and asked her to keep, just in case. It's worth noting that Katarina worked incredibly hard to support the family. She had an extremely busy schedule, sometimes taking on 10 to 12 clients a day and staying at work until as late as 1 a.m. She was paying off the car loan, covering daycare expenses, buying clothes for herself, her daughter and her new husband, paying for gas, car parts, her advanced training courses, and other daily expenses. But whenever Katya tried to talk to Alexei about finances, she'd end up facing another jealous outburst from him, complete with accusations about her living an inappropriate lifestyle. She often told her friends and her mom that she was going to get a divorce and admitted the marriage had been a mistake. But getting Alexei Tatarkin to leave her apartment was nearly impossible. By mid-February 2012, they finally separated, but their arguments continued. Katarina Gurova filed for divorce, and just a few days later she disappeared. On May 27, 2012, Katarina Gurova, a well-known beauty expert in Izhevsk, was reported missing. On May 28th, Katarina's mother decided to call Alexei. She didn't like him and didn't want to reach out, but Katarina hadn't answered her phone since the night before and hadn't called back, something that had never happened before. Alexei calmly said he didn't know where Katya was and even promised to check her apartment. But her mother knew Alexei Tatarkin wasn't telling the whole truth. That same day, she managed to find the number of her daughter's friend and reached out to her. From Naberezhnya Chelny, she called local morgues and hospitals and filed a missing person report with the police. The moment she heard the news, Katarina's mother rushed to Izhevsk. The apartment her daughter had been renting was locked, and her car was still parked in the courtyard. From that moment on, one of the largest search operations in the city's history began. Katya's friends tried to piece together what might have happened on the day she vanished. According to them, around 2 p.m., she was seen sitting in a cafe with a man. This information supposedly came from one of the waitresses. Afterward, Katya drove home in her car. Security cameras near her building showed that around 3:40 p.m., she parked in the courtyard and went inside. What happened next remains a mystery. Her car stayed in the parking lot, but Katya disappeared without a trace. Katya's mother mentioned that she tried calling her around 6 p.m. The phone rang, but Katya didn't answer. By 11 p.m., her phone was turned off and no one could reach her. Her loved ones insisted that Katya would never just leave town without telling anyone, even if it was for a short trip. On May 30th, 2012, the investigative department of the Pervomaisky district in Izhevsk, under the investigative committee of the Russian Federation for the Udmurt Republic, launched a criminal case under Part 1 of Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code, Crime, concerning Katarina Gurova's mysterious disappearance. The investigative committee of the Russian Federation for the Udmurt Republic took special control over the investigation. The search continued, and even a month later, Ekaterina was still nowhere to be found. The entire city of Izhevsk was searching for Ekaterina. Flyers with her photo were posted everywhere. Her friends even reached out to psychics for help. Dozens of volunteers, including her friends, acquaintances, and clients, teamed up with the police to search for her. They combed through the suburbs and different parts of the city based on tips from witnesses, but there were still no leads. Despite the tireless efforts of the police and volunteers, no progress was made. So Ekaterina's mother, Olga Gurova, filed complaints with every possible agency in Udmurtia, the republic's prosecutor, and even reached out to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. She received replies from all the offices stating that her letters had been registered. Only after this did the investigators start showing some renewed interest in the case. Ekaterina's husband was a prime suspect. He had been extremely jealous, and Ekaterina believed he was behind the disappearance of her documents right before their divorce. However, Alexei swore he had nothing to do with Katya's disappearance and claimed he didn't know anything. Right after she went missing, he was detained, questioned, and then released. Alexei then withdrew from the world, turned off his phone, and refused to communicate with anyone. The search continued. Proving Alexei Tatarkin's involvement in Katya's disappearance wasn't easy. The break came thanks to a waitress who'd withdrawn money from Katya's card at Alexei's request. When she saw the missing person posters a few days later, she contacted Katya's mother. Additionally, testimony from a neighbor helped the case. The neighbor had heard a scream coming from Katya's apartment. Other witnesses reported seeing Alexei driving Katya's car on the day she disappeared. The police seized the car, and during the investigation, they found traces of Ekaterina's blood inside. The forensic results came back in early July. By July 10th, Alexei Tatarkin was arrested. He kept insisting he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. He would put on a show during questioning, claiming he felt unwell, and we had to call an ambulance, recalled Yevgeny Fedorov, the lead investigator for high-priority cases with the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation for Udmurtia. But the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him, and there was no documented proof that he'd had a minor stroke, as he claimed. On July 12th, during yet another interrogation, he suddenly confessed to killing his wife. Alexei said he confessed because he was terrified. According to him, Ekaterina had been appearing to him in his dreams every night, talking to him and driving him insane. His confession came as a tragic gift on the eve of what would have been her birthday. On July 13th, the murdered Katarina Gurova would have turned 27, but even after confessing, he continued to mislead the investigation. One moment he claimed he committed the crime on the banks of the Kama River, and the next, he couldn't remember where he hid the remains. There were many odd details in the case of the young woman's disappearance, but the painstaking work of investigators helped piece together the sequence of events leading up to the crime against Katarina Gurova. The last person to see Katya alive was one of her students, Alina. They met at a cafe around 2 or 3 p.m. on May 27th. She wanted to open a beauty salon, Alina recalled. She wanted to hire me. We had just started talking when Katya's phone rang. From what I understood, the caller told her that someone had posted her personal messages online. Katya tried to check the internet on her phone but couldn't access anything. She said she was going home and would be back in about 30 minutes. She asked me to wait for her, the witness said. On her way home, Katya called her husband. They were already in the process of getting a divorce, and she suspected he was the one who had posted her messages, as he was very tech-savvy. She arranged to meet him at the building on Udmurtskaya Street, 161, where she'd been renting an apartment for the past 2 months after they'd separated. According to Alexei Tatarkin, they met in the building's entryway, and an argument broke out almost immediately. Katya accused him of leaking her personal messages with another man. In response, Alexei launched into accusations of his own. I asked my wife if the rumors I'd heard about her seeing other men were true. Her response basically implied I'd be an idiot not to have figured it out by now, Alexei told investigators. Without thinking, I grabbed a knife and stabbed Katya in the chest. After the stab, Katya collapsed to the floor. I caught her. I sat there on the floor with Katya lying on my knees. I stayed like that for about 10 minutes, and then she stopped showing signs of life. When I came to my senses, I realized I had taken her life. I took the knife and began dismembering the body to cover my tracks. A neighbor of Ekaterina's reported hearing a woman scream that lasted about 5 minutes. It sounded muffled at times, as if someone was covering her mouth. Afterward, the sound of running water could be heard in the bathroom for several hours. What Alexei Tatarkin did next was far from the behavior of someone acting in a blind rage. It seemed like everything he did was carefully calculated to create a perfect alibi. He didn't call an ambulance or attempt to save his wife. Instead, he cold-bloodedly dismembered her body into 9 pieces and packed them into garbage bags. Afterward, he sent 2 text messages from Katya's phone to his own, one saying she had gone for a drive and another saying she'd call him the next day. That same evening, he used her laptop to send messages pretending to be her, further throwing the investigation off track. Around 9 p.m., he took the bags outside and loaded them into a car he had received from a client for repairs the day before. He buried some of the remains near the village of Chilton and left the rest at a landfill near the village of Vozhoi in the Zabyalovsky district. After that, he calmly went home and continued watching as the entire city searched for the woman he had already buried. The official funeral for Katarina Gurova took place on July 17, 2012. She was laid to rest in a closed casket. First, a memorial service was held for her in Izhevsk, and then the hearse transported her coffin to Naberezhnya Chelny. Katya's family chose to bury her next to her father's grave. Many of her father's former colleagues came to say their goodbyes to Ekaterina and shared stories about how much he had adored his Tatyunya. Valery Gurov had worked for many years as an anesthesiologist at the perinatal center, but in October 2008, at just 45 years old, he passed away suddenly from cancer. Ekaterina left behind a 6-year-old daughter named Nastya. So why did her husband decide to confess to the crime a month and a half later? Katya's mother, Olga Gurova, suspected that even his confession was part of a calculated plan. She believed he waited just long enough so that the remains wouldn't be able to reveal exactly how the crime had been committed. There's plenty of information online about how, where, and at what rate a human body decomposes. It's possible that Alexei Tatarkin timed everything and only revealed the body when it was too late to determine how many wounds he inflicted or the exact way he attacked Katya. And what about the motive? Was it really just jealousy, or were there other reasons? If we go back to the beginning of their relationship, it's clear that their biggest fights were always about money. And indeed, Alexei Tatarkin had a complicated relationship with money. For example, according to Olga Gurova, Katya would give him the money to make monthly payments on her car loan. But starting in May 2011, those payments stopped. Meanwhile, Alexei kept promising Katya that he would soon pay off the loan entirely. Even during the investigation, he continued to insist that he'd been making regular payments out of his own pocket and that he'd given all the receipts to Katya. But in November 2011, a collection agency that had purchased the debt from the bank called a number listed in their database, which turned out to be Alexei's. He told them that his wife had been in a car accident, was in the hospital, and couldn't speak, but promised they would start paying off the loan soon. He managed to drag this out until May 2012. After Katya's death, he told them that now he was the one in the hospital. Money issues were at the root of most of the major arguments in their relationship. Katya was unhappy with the fact that Alexei didn't have a steady source of income, but seemed to have endless expenses for what he claimed were business ventures. Gurova and Tatarkin were complete opposites. She was open and honest, while he was cunning and greedy. And to top it off, he was extremely jealous. To be fair, there was some basis for Tatarkin's jealousy. During the trial, Alexei's friends testified that he had repeatedly asked them to spy on his wife. During one of these stakeouts, they caught Ekaterina flirting with another man. Moreover, with his background as a system administrator and computer expert, Alexei secretly monitored her social media messages, which only fueled his jealousy further. Alexei Tatarkin could be described as emotionally unstable, and any concern he showed for Ekaterina was just an act. The investigation also revealed that Alexei didn't have a college degree at all. He hadn't even finished one course of study, and he had never served in the military, let alone in Chechnya, as he had claimed. The entire criminal case was documented in 7 thick volumes, containing testimony from dozens of witnesses, results from multiple forensic reports, and descriptions of investigative actions. To recap, Ekaterina Gurova disappeared on the night of May 27th last year. For a month and a half, not only her family and the police, but also teams of volunteers searched for her, combing through nearby forests, checking basements, and exploring abandoned buildings. From the court verdict, one witness stated, Tatarkin constantly picked fights and argued with Gurova. Before they got married, Gurova had decided to withdraw her marriage application, and in response, Tatarkin attempted suicide. In February 2012, Gurova left Tatarkin and started living separately. In early May, Tatarkin pretended to have a stroke. Their divorce hearing was scheduled for June 6, 2012. Gurova trusted Tatarkin to handle her loan payments. From Tatarkin's own testimony, I put the body parts in trash bags and carried them to my car, a Vaz 21053. Then I drove to the village of Nechkino. I took the bags with Gurova's body parts from the trunk and tried to sink them in the river, but they wouldn't sink. I tied bags of bricks with rope to the torso, but they came loose. After that, I drove from Nechkino back toward Izhevsk. When he returned to the apartment, Tatarkin cleaned the floors and wiped away the blood. He gathered the blood-stained items in a bag and, along with the rest of the body parts in other bags, placed them back in the car. At that moment, he noticed a message had popped up on Gurova's laptop from one of her friends. Pretending to be a Katarina, he replied that she had supposedly gone out of town for a drive. To create an alibi for himself, the killer also sent 2 text messages from her phone to his own, saying that Katya was asking him not to worry and that she would definitely call him back the next day. From the testimony of the accused, Tatarkin, I left the torso in a wooded area on the left side of the road. I covered the bags with leaves but didn't bury them. The bags were about 30 yards apart. I left the sweater I was wearing at the time of the crime there as well. Then I drove to Zavyalovo, onto the Staropolsky highway, and after reaching the sign for Stary Chiltum, I turned right and buried the remaining body parts along with the clothes. As the witness statements were being read in court, Ekaterina's mother, Olga, became overwhelmed. Unable to contain her sobs, she had to step out into the hallway where paramedics were called for her. The judge took nearly an hour and a half to read the verdict. Alexei Tatarkin was sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in a maximum security penal colony. The prosecutor had requested a 10-year sentence. There was no appeal. Neither Katarina Gurova's family lawyer nor her mother was present for the sentencing. None of Alexei's relatives attended either. Attached to the criminal case was a claim for damages, where Katarina's mother requested 5 million rubles for emotional distress. She also submitted documents seeking reimbursement for funeral expenses totaling 30,000 rubles. The court approved reimbursement of funeral expenses. However, regarding the 5 million rubles in emotional compensation, the court suggested that Ekaterina's mother file a separate civil lawsuit. As the verdict was being read, Alexei Tatarkin's face remained expressionless. The one thing he seemed relieved about was that Katya had stopped appearing in his dreams. It's heartbreaking to think of this wonderful woman who never got the chance to escape from the monster she married. With her kind and hopeful nature, Ekaterina saw light where there was only darkness, and she failed to see the evil in Alexei. Maybe the problem is that from a young age, women are told they absolutely need a man by their side, that without him, they're somehow incomplete. This mindset leads to a kind of self-esteem that makes it easy to end up married to whoever comes along. How little must she have valued herself to let a man stay in her life who couldn't even buy her flowers with his own money and had to steal from her purse? Why are we, as women, so blind? Katya realized early on that he was a phony, not a real man. A loving man would protect his woman, would make her happy with even the smallest gifts, just to see her smile. But by then, Katya was already trapped in his snare, one she couldn't escape alive. In 2022, Alexei Tatarkin was released and returned to Izhevsk. So much for justice. But we're not the ones who write the laws or make the decisions. What we can do is learn from stories like this. This case should serve as a warning to beautiful, successful women, those who are so confident in themselves and the goodness of the world that they end up choosing someone who seems like a devoted servant, a reliable partner, a simple guy who manages to worm his way into your life. You trust him with everything, your children, your property, thinking he's so loyal. But sooner or later, that same guy will stab you in the back because deep down, he knows he'll never reach or experience the success you have, and that realization will eat away at his ego, slowly and painfully. Justice comes from above, and sooner or later this criminal will face it. In the dim light of a single lamp, weak shadows danced across the walls, accompanied by raised voices. It wasn't just an argument. It was something more, something intense and unsettling, almost primal in its ferocity. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the air, as if something heavy had slammed against the wall. Then came the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze. The silence that followed was deafening, filling the space like a thick fog. Outside the house, there wasn't a soul in sight. No one witnessed the scene, but the sharp crack of the firearm pierced the stillness of the night, as if slicing through it like a shard of glass. Minutes after the gunshot, Perth police received a frantic call to the emergency services. A woman's voice, trembling and panicked, reported a shooting and said someone had been injured. "He's not moving. Oh my God, help!" the woman screamed, her voice breaking. The dispatcher immediately sent a patrol unit, and officers arrived at the scene within minutes. The flashing lights revealed a woman standing on the front lawn, visibly shaken. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and her whole body trembled uncontrollably. Inside the house, chaos awaited the officers. In the living room lay the body of James Watson, 38 years old. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, his eyes wide open, and a dark pool of blood had begun spreading across the floor. The blood soaked into the carpet, staining the furniture and walls. The officers quickly noticed signs of a struggle. Chairs were overturned, and there were clear marks of impact on both the furniture and the walls. The entire room was in disarray, pointing to a violent confrontation before the shot was fired. Next to the body lay a shotgun, its barrel pointed towards the door. At first glance, it seemed like someone had broken into the house, but there were no signs of forced entry. Officers cordoned off the area and called for detectives and forensic teams to collect evidence. It was clear to them that this wasn't just a random crime. There was something far more complex behind it. The woman they found on the lawn was identified as Catherine Watson, James's wife. She was in shock, and paramedics on the scene tried to calm her down. Her hands were covered in blood, and she was too distraught to speak coherently. When she was brought to the police station, all she could say was, "I didn't mean to. I didn't know it would end like this." Investigators began their search for answers. The first step was questioning the neighbors, but no one had heard anything unusual before the gunshot. One neighbor, an elderly man named Mark Ridley, mentioned that he saw Catherine and James returning home together that evening. They looked tense, but he didn't think much of it. Police took down his statement, though it didn't provide any significant leads. Meanwhile, forensic experts inside the house uncovered more and more evidence, suggesting that the conflict had started long before the gunshot. On the kitchen table, they found an open envelope. Inside were several documents and photographs. At first, they didn't seem particularly important, but upon closer inspection, the investigators noticed that some of the photos captured personal moments from the family's life. These images could potentially hold the key to understanding the motive behind the incident. Detectives worked to piece together the events of that evening. Around 8 p.m., Catherine and James returned home after a tense dinner at a restaurant. According to those who knew them, the dinner had been uncomfortable, but nothing had hinted at the coming tragedy. At one point, James mentioned that he needed to leave and take care of something, but Catherine insisted he stay. She told him there was something they needed to discuss. When they got back home, Catherine suggested they relax with a drink and spend the evening quietly. She left James in the living room and went upstairs, taking the envelope with her. James, seemingly unaware of what was coming, stayed downstairs. Catherine eventually came back down the stairs, holding the documents tightly in her hands, her face expressionless. She placed the envelope on the table in front of him and stood there, waiting for his reaction. James saw the envelope and his expression changed. He tried to remain calm, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Catherine didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. A heavy silence hung in the air. This was the moment when everything shifted. A heated argument erupted between them, escalating quickly into a shouting match. At one point, James tried to grab the envelope, but Catherine held onto it, refusing to let go of the documents. As investigators examined the room where the shot was fired, they discovered a broken chair that appeared to have been used as a weapon. Scattered across the floor were papers and photographs, some of which were stained with blood. All the evidence pointed to a struggle over the documents between James and Catherine. Detectives concluded that the shot was fired at the moment when James was trying to take something from Catherine. It was clear from the marks on the carpet and the position of the shotgun that Catherine had pulled the trigger. When police accessed James and Catherine's phones, they uncovered several intriguing details. James's phone had been turned off at 10:30 p.m., which was unusual considering his typical behavior. Surveillance footage from a camera outside their house confirmed that James had left around that time, but returned just 10 minutes later. What he did during those few minutes remained a mystery. Catherine, still in shock when she was brought to the station, couldn't provide a clear explanation of what had transpired. According to her, they had started arguing, and at some point, things spiraled out of control. She claimed not to remember how she ended up holding the shotgun. Detectives noted the stress she was clearly under, but they also sensed there was more to her story. Investigators began digging deeper into the Watsons' relationship. The couple had been married for 10 years, had no children, and outwardly appeared to have a calm life. However, neighbors pointed out that James had been spending less time at home in recent months, which had raised suspicions for Catherine. No one knew the exact nature of what was going on between them, but the tension in their interactions hadn't gone unnoticed by close friends and neighbors. The investigation also revealed that just a week before the incident, Catherine had contacted a private investigator. The reasons for this were unclear. Perhaps she was gathering evidence against her husband, but exactly what she was investigating was still unknown. Later that evening, police received the results of the forensic analysis of the weapon found at the scene. James's fingerprints were discovered on the shotgun, but they seemed odd, like he had only handled it briefly. This led detectives to wonder, could someone else have used the weapon in the critical moment? The morning after the incident, Perth police returned to Catherine and James Watson's home. The crime scene remained sealed off, with forensic teams continuing to gather evidence, while detectives worked to piece together a clearer picture of what had occurred. On the surface, it appeared to be a sudden outburst of aggression during an argument, but the details raised doubts about the simplicity of this explanation. Detective Richard Hale, leading the investigation, decided to review the surveillance footage again to make sure nothing had been overlooked. The footage showed James leaving the house at 10:30 p.m. and returning 10 minutes later, but there was a small inconsistency between the frames. The video showed him speaking with someone in a car parked by the curb. The camera captured a shadowy figure, but the face of the person James was talking to was indistinguishable. Hale realized this might be a crucial lead and began investigating who could have been outside the house at that moment. Meanwhile, detectives continued their second round of questioning with Catherine, but her mental state remained unstable. She insisted that she couldn't recall how things escalated and claimed everything happened too quickly. Her words were jumbled, and her eyes appeared vacant. However, Detective Hale noticed a brief change in her expression when he asked about the car seen on the surveillance footage, as if she was trying to hide something. At the same time, investigators were thoroughly examining the contents of the envelope found at the scene. Inside were indeed several photographs taken by a private investigator. The photos showed James with a young woman, but her face was always obscured. The report from the investigator detailed several places where they had met: a cafe in downtown Perth, a shopping mall parking lot, and a motel on the outskirts of the city. However, the woman's name wasn't mentioned in the report. Hale concluded that Catherine had hired the private investigator to follow her husband, but how these photographs tied into the crime was still unclear. Investigators decided to visit the office of the private investigator mentioned in the report. They found him, a man named Thomas Morgan, who looked somewhat uneasy when he saw the detectives. Morgan confirmed that Catherine had contacted him about 2 weeks prior, saying her husband had been acting suspiciously. She suspected he was being unfaithful but didn't provide many details. Morgan showed the detectives copies of the photos taken during a week of surveillance. The images clearly showed James meeting with the woman. Though her face was always hidden, she was either turning away or wearing a hood. Morgan claimed he had handed over all the gathered material to Catherine just a day before the tragic event. Detective Hale returned to Catherine and showed her the photos taken by the private investigator. Her reaction remained emotionless, but she admitted that she had suspected James of being unfaithful. She said she intended to confront him with the evidence at a family discussion to find out the truth and decide the future of their marriage. However, she maintained that she never meant to harm him. According to her, things spiraled out of control when James saw the photos and accused her of spying on him. She claimed that the argument turned into a physical struggle and, eventually, the fatal shot. but she couldn't remember exactly how it happened. As detectives tried to determine whether Catherine's account was truthful, they received the forensic results on the fingerprints found on the shotgun. While James's prints were indeed present, forensic experts determined they had been placed on the gun well before the shot was fired. Catherine had claimed the gun was kept in the house for protection and insisted she had never touched it. This statement contradicted the forensic findings, and investigators began to suspect that someone had tampered with the weapon in an attempt to mislead the police. The surveillance footage of James talking to someone in a car became a key piece of evidence. Detective Hale sent a copy of the recording for further analysis, hoping to identify the car's license plate and figure out who might have been outside the Watsons' home that evening. While waiting for the results, detectives reviewed Catherine and James's phone records, searching for additional clues. They discovered that on the night of the incident, Catherine had sent several text messages to her sister Lisa. The content of the messages raised suspicions. They seemed like attempts to explain or justify something. One message read, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Another contained a request to meet. Lisa hadn't replied to these messages, which alarmed Hale. He decided to call her in for questioning to find out if she knew anything about that night's events. When Lisa arrived at the station, she appeared tense. She confirmed that she had spoken with Catherine the day before, but not on the night of the incident. According to Lisa, they had discussed an upcoming family gathering. She claimed to know nothing about what had happened and said she had been home the entire evening. However, her nervous demeanor and hesitant answers raised red flags for the detectives. Hale decided to check her phone records and location data to verify her alibi. While the questioning continued, investigators received the results from the analysis of the surveillance video. The license plate on the car parked outside the Watsons' house belonged to Lisa. This revelation heightened their suspicions, and Hale changed his approach during the interrogation, asking Lisa direct questions about her whereabouts that night. At first, she tried to make excuses, but under pressure, she finally admitted that she had been outside the house when James stepped out. Her explanation, however, was confusing. She claimed she had come to talk to her sister but decided to leave after seeing James, without ever getting out of the car. Hale knew something didn't add up. He returned to analyzing Lisa's phone records and discovered that on the night of the incident, she had received a message from James, urging her to come over immediately. But why would James call Lisa when he was supposed to be with Catherine, and what could they have been discussing privately? Meanwhile, forensic experts found another crucial piece of evidence. In the bedroom where Catherine said the argument began, they discovered traces of blood on the door handle that didn't match Catherine or James. This led detectives to suspect that a third person had been present during the conflict. A DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Lisa. Now, investigators had proof that Lisa had been inside the house, despite her previous denials. The police confronted Lisa with the new evidence. She tried to defend herself, claiming she had only come to protect Catherine, but when the argument between James and Catherine started, she panicked and tried to leave. She insisted she had no involvement in the crime and didn't know who fired the shot. However, her story became increasingly tangled as the questioning continued. Detectives were beginning to suspect that Catherine and Lisa might be hiding something. They had a theory that James's possible affair could have triggered a conflict between the sisters, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Hale decided to temporarily let Lisa go, asking her not to leave town. He sensed they were close to solving the mystery, but one key piece of evidence was still missing to fully uncover the truth about that night. The next day, Detective Richard Hale and his team returned to the Watson home for a more thorough inspection. With each new clue, it became clear that this wasn't a simple crime. Hale felt there was much more beneath the surface than just a family argument that ended in tragedy. The police combed through every room again, checking for details that might shed more light on the case. They closely examined the photographs found in the envelope. The detectives believed the private investigator's photos, commissioned by Catherine, were central to the motive, but the woman's face in the pictures remained blurred and hidden. This complicated the investigation as they couldn't definitively identify her. While the forensic team continued their work, Hale decided to bring Lisa back in for questioning, this time not as a witness, but as a potential suspect. Lisa appeared nervous, but agreed to cooperate. Hale chose to use a more direct approach, presenting her with the results of the blood analysis found on the door handle. He asked her why her blood was found inside the house if she had claimed she never got out of her car. Lisa once again tried to explain, but her answers were unconvincing. She suggested she might have accidentally scratched herself while entering the house, but her story seemed flimsy. Hale realized that pushing further wouldn't be productive and decided to give her some time, though he was certain there was more to her story than she was letting on. Meanwhile, investigators analyzed Lisa and James's phone records. They found several messages James had sent to Lisa just before his death. One text read, "Come over immediately," while another specified the location for a meeting. The messages had an urgent, almost desperate tone, leading Hale to believe that James had a sense something serious was about to happen. He instructed his team to dig deeper into their past interactions to see if there had been other similar meetings or communications. Detectives also began reviewing James's emails and social media accounts. They uncovered a string of messages between James and Lisa dating back several weeks. In these exchanges, James and Lisa discussed some serious steps that needed to be taken soon. The messages hinted at a plan, but the specifics were vague. Hale started to piece together that there was more to the relationship between James and Lisa than just a family bond. As the investigation gained momentum, Catherine remained in a state of stress. Detectives decided to return to her for further questioning, hoping to clarify the events of that night. Hale began asking about her relationship with Lisa, but Catherine was reluctant to discuss her sister. She mentioned that they had been close, but their relationship had deteriorated in recent months. Catherine didn't go into details, but hinted that conflicts had arisen in their family, not all of which involved James. Sensing an opportunity, Hale pressed harder, asking if Catherine knew that James had been meeting with Lisa. He showed her messages from James's phone, but her reaction remained neutral. She claimed she had no knowledge of these meetings, and that her only suspicion was about James possibly being unfaithful with another woman, but not with Lisa. At that moment, Hale realized that either Catherine truly knew nothing, or she was deliberately hiding the truth. Shifting their focus, the detectives decided to investigate Lisa's home. They obtained a search warrant and headed to her residence to gather more evidence. During the search, they found a notebook filled with notes about meetings and phone calls with James. The entries included names, dates, and addresses, one of which was Catherine and James's home. This confirmed that Lisa was not only aware of James's every move, but may have been planning her visits. Hale began to suspect that Lisa played a central role in what had happened. Further digging revealed a photograph in Lisa's house showing her and James together at the beach. The picture appeared to be recent and they looked quite close. This became a critical lead. Hale now realized that James and Lisa had a romantic relationship, one that Catherine either hadn't suspected or had intentionally ignored. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed their analysis of the shotgun. The results indicated that Lisa's fingerprints were indeed on the weapon, but they were left after James's prints. This led detectives to believe that Lisa had handled the shotgun after James was already injured. Hale began to suspect that Lisa might have tampered with the crime scene to mislead the investigation. At the same time, investigators uncovered footage from a hotel where James and Lisa had met. The video showed them talking, discussing something, before Lisa left and James stayed behind. Their behavior was intimate, providing further proof of a relationship that Catherine was unaware of. This strengthened the theory that Lisa and James were involved in something deeper, and that their secret connection had played a major part in the events leading to that tragic night. Hale decided to act quickly. He summoned Lisa back to the station and this time presented her with the new evidence: photos, videos, and fingerprints. Lisa tried to remain composed, but under pressure she began to crack. She admitted that she had indeed been seeing James behind Catherine's back. She explained that their affair had started over a year ago, but she never intended to destroy her sister's marriage. Everything was kept secret until Catherine began suspecting James of infidelity and hired a private investigator. Hale pressed further, asking what Lisa and James discussed that night. Lisa claimed that James had wanted to meet to talk about how best to confess the truth to Catherine, but things quickly got out of control. She confessed that she had come to the house but hadn't intended to interfere. However, when she heard the shouting, she entered the house and saw Catherine and James struggling. According to her, she tried to stop them but didn't make it in time. Detectives began verifying her story, but all the evidence pointed to Lisa being inside the house at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage, blood analysis, and fingerprints all confirmed her presence. The question remained: was she directly involved in the confrontation or merely a witness? but Hale was certain she was hiding more than she was letting on. Meanwhile, investigators examined James and Lisa's financial records. They discovered that shortly before the incident, James had transferred a large sum of money to Lisa's account. It seemed like payment for something, but the reason behind it remained unclear. Hale began to suspect that Lisa was involved in a larger plan, perhaps even orchestrating the crime. Later that evening, detectives received a breakthrough from the forensic team. They had found a phone belonging to Lisa, hidden under the mattress in Catherine and James's bedroom. When the detectives accessed the phone, they uncovered text messages that confirmed their suspicions. James and Lisa had been planning to stage an attack and frame Catherine for it. The messages discussed various details of the plan, but for some reason, things didn't go as intended. Hale realized they now had enough evidence to arrest Lisa. He ordered her detainment, and during a subsequent interrogation, Lisa, backed into a corner, admitted that there had indeed been a plan. She claimed that James had threatened to expose her if she didn't help him get rid of Catherine. However, she insisted that the shooting was an accident and that she never intended for things to go this far. Hale knew he was close to solving the case, but one key question remained. If Lisa and James had planned everything together, why did the plan fall apart? And who actually pulled the trigger? Detective Richard Hale felt like the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but one crucial question still lingered. Who had really pulled the trigger, and why had James and Lisa's plan gone wrong? The gathered evidence and Lisa's confession pointed to a conspiracy, but the full details were still unclear. In the interrogation room, Lisa continued to insist that she had no part in the crime and never intended to harm James. She tried to convince the detectives that their original plan was only to stage an incident that would make it look like Catherine had attacked James. But when the situation escalated, things spiraled out of control. According to her, when the struggle began, she found herself on the sidelines, unsure of what to do. Hale listened carefully, but he could tell that Lisa was still withholding something. He decided to launch one final review of the case to reconstruct the entire sequence of events from that night. The detectives returned to the Watson home, carefully reviewing surveillance footage and re-examining the crime scene to ensure they hadn't missed anything. During the re-examination, forensic experts uncovered a small but significant clue on the shotgun that had previously gone unnoticed. A strand of hair was found under the stock, and tests revealed it belonged to Catherine. This discovery gave Hale pause. Perhaps Catherine had held the gun either before or right after the shot was fired. It also explained why her account had been so confused. Maybe she genuinely couldn't remember how things unfolded in those critical moments when emotions ran high. The detectives also reviewed Catherine's phone records from just before the shooting. They discovered that she had contacted the private investigator she had hired and arranged a meeting for the next day. This confirmed that she had serious intentions of confronting the situation and possibly holding James accountable for his infidelity. But if she had these plans, why had the situation escalated into a tragedy? Hale decided to revisit Catherine's statements. His goal was to determine whether she had been manipulated, or if she had been involved in the conflict from the start. He began questioning her more assertively, but Catherine still claimed she couldn't recall the exact details. She described how she and James started arguing and how he tried to take the envelope with the photos from her. Everything happened too fast, and at some point, everything just went dark. As the investigation progressed, detectives gained access to a security camera in the living room that they had initially missed. It turned out James had installed the camera himself, providing an unexpected twist in the case. The footage showed Catherine and James arguing. Lisa didn't appear on camera, but her voice could be heard. She was pleading with James to stop and saying they needed to resolve things peacefully. At one point, James tried to snatch the envelope from Catherine's hands, and she pushed him away, sparking a physical struggle. The video showed Catherine losing control of the situation. James grabbed her wrists, and at that moment, Lisa ran into the room, attempting to break up the fight. She positioned herself between them, but somehow ended up holding the shotgun. It appeared she intended to de-escalate the situation, but things didn't go as planned. The video captured the crucial moment when Lisa, in a state of panic, unintentionally pointed the shotgun at James in an attempt to scare him. James made a sudden move, and that's when the gun went off. Catherine collapsed to the floor as Lisa stood frozen, the shotgun still in her hands. For several seconds, she stared at James lying motionless on the ground, her face contorted in pure horror. Slowly, she lowered the shotgun and ran out of the frame. Catherine, trembling and in shock, slowly got up and frantically dialed emergency services, her voice shaky and panicked. Detective Hale now understood what had happened. Lisa, caught in the middle of the escalating conflict, had fired the shot in a moment of sheer panic, likely not even realizing what she was doing. The plan that James and Lisa had concocted to stage an attack and pin the blame on Catherine had backfired. When the situation reached its breaking point, Lisa, overwhelmed by fear, lost control, and the tragedy became inevitable. Hale decided to conclude the case by charging Lisa with involuntary manslaughter. She broke down in tears, insisting that she never intended to cause harm, but the evidence was undeniable. The investigators recognized that, while her actions stemmed from panic, she had been aware she was holding a firearm and could have chosen not to use it. When Catherine learned the full truth, she remained in shock. She realized that her sister wasn't just a participant in the scheme, but the one whose actions had ultimately led to James's death. Despite her grief, Catherine agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing all the necessary evidence to help the police bring the case to a close. In the end, Lisa pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to 6 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to stage a crime. Catherine left Perth to start a new life, determined to leave behind the tragic events that had forever altered her family. In one of the brightest and most bustling cities, a tragedy took place that shocked everyone. Aajan Yalova, a young and ambitious woman with dreams of a bright future, became the victim of a horrific crime. This incident not only took her life but also exposed serious societal issues like violence and negligence within law enforcement. Aajan's family and loved ones were devastated, and their pain was deepened by the fact that the police ignored their desperate pleas for help. During this challenging time, they felt like they were losing not just a daughter and sister, but also their hope for justice. Friends who remembered her kindness and warm personality were stunned by the criminal's cruelty, who continued to post provocative updates on social media even while behind bars. But let's start from the beginning. Aajan's story soon became a symbol of the fight for justice, reminding everyone of the value of life and the importance of protecting women. This tragedy touched many hearts and made people think about how to prevent such cases in the future. In Almaty, a city where life usually moved along peacefully, March 19, 2021, became a day of unease. The remains found scattered in different parts of the city shocked residents and left a deep scar in many hearts. Shortly after these horrifying discoveries, the family of 19-year-old Aajan Yalova faced a brutal reality. They had to go through a difficult DNA test process to confirm that the remains belonged to their missing relative. Behind every smile was a lurking shadow ready to break free, and now the entire city found itself in the grip of an invisible manipulator. Before the world knew of Aajan's tragic fate, on March 18th, she was full of hope and excitement. That day she uploaded a new video on TikTok, dancing and laughing, radiating positivity and joy. On screen, she looked genuinely happy, and her followers could feel her energy. Aajan was always eager to share moments from her life and creativity with her audience, and at that time, her dreams of a future filled with design and success seemed entirely within reach. However, there was another, less visible side to Aajan's life. Secret conversations and promising talks brought a stranger into her world, whose true nature remained hidden. His intentions had nothing in common with her dreams, and while she eagerly awaited the chance to launch her brand, shadows were closing in around her. That evening, as her joyful plans began to crumble, Aajan had no idea that fate had a dark turn in store for her. Aajan was in her 4th year at the Academy of Design and Fashion, where every day brought new knowledge and inspiration. She was one of the most dedicated students, never missing a class without a good reason. Even on a day when many of her classmates might have taken a break, she remained committed to her studies. That morning, full of enthusiasm, she went to class, dreaming of her future in the world of fashion. After her classes, Aajan worked at a nail salon as a manicurist. This job not only provided her with an income, but also gave her a chance to connect with different people helping her develop both personal and professional skills. Her love for sewing started back in her childhood when she first made a dress for her doll or crafted a small souvenir for her mom. Over time, this passion only grew stronger, and now Aajan was determined to pursue a future in fashion. However, just days before she disappeared, a quiet wave of changes swept through the city, leaving a sense of unease in every corner. One question lingered. Who would be the next victim in the dark game started by this invisible manipulator? On the night of March 20th, 2021, Almaty was gripped by fear as the search for 19-year-old Aajan Yalova began. Friends and family, noticing her sudden disappearance, immediately raised the alarm. Aajan, known for her hard work and sense of responsibility, never neglected her commitments. On the morning of March 19th, as she headed home from her job at the nail salon, she felt satisfied. Her day had gone well, and she'd made new connections. But something went terribly wrong that evening. The dormitory where Aajan lived, not far from the Academy of Design and Fashion, was usually filled with friendly chatter and laughter. But on that night, as the doors locked at 11 p.m., Aajan wasn't there. Moral Bakirov, the dorm supervisor, later admitted that he'd never seen Aajan stay out late or miss a night. When her friends began to worry, they approached Moral, and together they decided to contact the police. However, the response they received was cold. "Wait it out. She'll come back when she's done having fun." As the hours passed with no sign of her, Aajan's relatives from Taldykorgan began losing hope. Even her boyfriend had no idea where she might be. This pushed her family to reach out to the police once again, urging them to start a search. Aajan's older sister, who lived in Almaty, tried to file a missing persons report but was met with indifference. The police told her they were all busy with protests and advised her to wait. Frustrated but determined, the family decided to try again, but still, the authorities showed little interest. Realizing they wouldn't get much help, they turned to local volunteers for assistance. Flyers with Aajan's picture were posted all over Almaty. Volunteers, full of determination, organized search efforts, hoping to find Aajan safe and sound. Looking back at the events leading up to her disappearance, it's important to note that Aajan eagerly enrolled in the Academy of Design and Fashion, leaving her hometown of Taldykorgan filled with hope and ambition. Alongside her studies, she actively sewed custom-made clothing and developed her online store, where she launched her brand, Ayalan. This business brought her financial independence and a sense of fulfillment from the creative process. Recently, her shop had been doing exceptionally well, with a growing number of orders that filled her with joy and inspiration. To fulfill her dream of expanding into the Turkish market, Aajan signed up for Turkish language courses. Despite the challenges, she showed persistence, and her teachers noted her dedication and eagerness to learn. Their belief in her potential only fueled her determination. There was a light of resolve in her eyes, and every step she took brought her closer to her goals. Her shifts at the nail salon where she worked part-time usually ended around 9 p.m. Aajan always made sure to leave her workstation spotless, believing it added a welcoming touch for clients. As she locked the doors, she felt hopeful, confident that her hard work was paying off. But fate had an unexpected twist in store for her. By March 21st, the search for Aajan Yalova had intensified, and the police finally got involved, forming a special investigation team to handle this complex case. On that day, the tireless efforts of the volunteers, who had been working around the clock, finally paid off. They obtained a crucial lead. They found the taxi driver who had picked up Aajan and a young man on March 19th in the Nurkant neighborhood. The volunteers immediately passed this information to the police, who quickly obtained footage from security cameras. The video clearly showed Aajan entering the elevator of a high-rise building with an unidentified man. This discovery marked a turning point in the investigation, sparking hope that there was still a chance to save her. It took investigators only a few minutes to identify the young man and locate his address. On the evening of March 21st at around 10 p.m., police officers arrived at the residence of 28-year-old Rahman Berdid Taribekov. According to reports, he was at home but refused to open the door, further raising the officers' suspicions. After a brief discussion, they decided to break in. When they forced their way inside, they were met with a horrifying scene. Blood stains everywhere and a dismembered body lying on the floor. Even the most seasoned detectives, accustomed to such grim discoveries, were shaken by what they found. The apartment's owner wasn't found right away. He had hidden himself carefully, hoping to avoid law enforcement. However, once they finally tracked him down, he attempted to take his own life. Fortunately, first responders arrived in time to administer first aid before the paramedics got there. He was rushed into emergency surgery, and while doctors worked to save his life, police began collecting evidence and piecing together the full story of what happened. The criminal would finally have to face justice for his horrific actions. After spending several days in the hospital and once his condition had stabilized, Tarabekov was transferred to a detention center. This move was crucial not only for his safety, but also to ensure that the investigation could proceed without delay. Public interest in the case was growing rapidly, and it was clear it would attract widespread attention. While the suspect was still in the hospital, his rented apartment was sealed off and a thorough forensic investigation took place, involving the city's top crime scene investigators and experts. What they uncovered inside shocked even the most hardened detectives to their core. At first glance, it was hard to believe that someone who appeared so ordinary could have committed such unspeakable acts. The apartment contained a human scalp, skin, extracted teeth and nails, all meticulously placed in separate plastic bags, almost as if they were harmless trinkets. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie, and even the most experienced officers understood that this was not just a crime, but a chilling display of pure madness. Additionally, investigators found dismembered body parts and a skull in the apartment. As the medical examiners later confirmed, the victim's head had been boiled in water for an extended period, leaving nothing but the skull behind. The entire scene was profoundly disturbing, and even the most seasoned law enforcement officers struggled to keep their composure in the face of such horror. As they gathered evidence and searched for more answers in Aajan's case, law enforcement found themselves confronted with a true nightmare. In the days following her disappearance, other parts of her body were discovered scattered around the city, tossed in dumpsters and abandoned basements. These horrifying discoveries painted a grim and sinister picture that investigators tried desperately to piece together. The family's last hope of identifying the remains through DNA testing was shattered when they began to understand the sheer magnitude of the tragedy. Aajan Yalova went missing on March 19th, and shortly afterward, her family received the devastating confirmation. The remains found across the city did in fact belong to their daughter. During questioning, the suspect, who was found guilty, recounted the events of the night between March 19th and 20, when he and Aajan had an argument. According to him, at around 11 p.m., he lost control and killed her. Realizing he could be caught, he decided to dispose of her body by dismembering it. That same night, he took several parts out of his apartment and left them scattered across the city, as if trying to completely erase any trace of his crime. When investigators asked about any possible connection between him and the victim, he firmly denied having any. But this claim still needed to be verified, and Aajan's family was left bewildered. Why would he go to the extent of pulling out her teeth, removing her skin, and cutting her nails if he was simply trying to cover up his crime? Aajan's family began to suspect that she might not have been his first victim. As the investigation progressed, it was discovered that Tarabekov had previously studied at a medical academy to become a pharmacist, but was expelled for poor performance. This information only deepened investigators' suspicions that the body parts might have been used for some sort of medical or commercial purpose. Forensic experts began digging into his social media conversations and checking all the women he had interacted with. Fortunately, none of them were harmed, but the investigation continued to delve deeper into his life. During the investigation, a chat between Tarabekov and Aajan on a dating site was uncovered. When this information leaked online, many started speculating about the possibility that Aajan might have entered into a relationship with him for financial reasons. These rumors sparked a wave of discussions, with countless people sharing their theories about what might have happened. Attention was also drawn to the footage showing Aajan entering the elevator with the young man. However, her friends and acquaintances were quick to defend her, insisting that she was modest and always respected boundaries in her interactions with men. Aajan's family knew how much effort she had put into building her online store and clothing brand. They were convinced that Tarabekov had lured her to his apartment under the pretense of business, possibly to take measurements or place an order. They simply couldn't believe that such a ruthless person could have set such a trap. Aajan's roommate in the dorm, who was someone she confided in about her deepest thoughts, recalled some unsettling events before her disappearance. Aajan had recently mentioned that a man had shown interest in her brand and wanted to buy her entire collection. While this news initially excited her, it also made her a bit wary, since Aajan was always cautious around strangers. Investigators concluded that Tarabekov might have orchestrated this meeting to lure her into a trap under the guise of a business opportunity. At the center of it all was a man named Rahman Berdid Tarabekov, who, according to the investigation, had connected with Aajan Yalova through a popular social media platform. Using the excuse that he needed clothing from her brand, he convinced her to come to his place where the terrible incident seemingly took place. Aajan's family went through unimaginable pain as they waited for her body to be released for burial. Those days were filled with unbearable uncertainty and fear. Her loved ones desperately sought any information about what had happened to their daughter, experiencing an overwhelming sense of grief. It wasn't until April 16th, 2021, almost a month later, that her body was finally handed over for the funeral. Aajan was laid to rest in her hometown of Taldykorgan, where friends, family, and acquaintances gathered to pay their final respects and say goodbye. The atmosphere was thick with sorrow and loss as people shared memories of her kindness and vibrant spirit. The investigation faced numerous rumors and gossip that tarnished Yalova's reputation. Messages exchanged between her and Tarabekov, obtained by investigators, proved that accusations of her being promiscuous were completely baseless. This only fueled the heated discussions in the community, where her friends and acquaintances refused to believe that Tarabekov was capable of such brutality. Teachers and classmates of Tarabekov described him as a quiet and modest young man who would never commit a crime, claiming he was either framed or caught up in some misunderstanding. Meanwhile, law enforcement conducted countless forensic examinations to uncover the truth and gather all the evidence. The family's attorney, Katarina Gurova, mentioned in one of his interviews that the case consisted of around 30 volumes with over 30 forensic examinations conducted. This extensive investigation demanded tremendous effort and time from the authorities. Despite this, psychiatric evaluations confirmed that Tarabekov was sane and fully aware of his actions when he committed the crime. At the trial, which marked the final chapter of this horrific case, Aajan's family demanded the harshest possible punishment for the criminal, along with compensation for emotional damages totaling 26 billion tenge. After carefully reviewing all the details, the court handed down the maximum sentence of 25 years in prison, but they found no grounds for imposing a life sentence. However, the court did partially grant the civil lawsuit, awarding 20 million tenge in compensation, which, though only a small measure, could at least offer some relief to the family during their painful ordeal. Aajan Yalova's relatives recalled with horror and anger the fateful day when they first went to the local police station, desperately hoping for help. Their anxiety was genuine and urgent, but to their immense disappointment, law enforcement ignored their repeated pleas to launch an immediate search for the missing young woman. This refusal not only shocked the family, but became an unbearable burden that they couldn't leave behind, amplifying their sense of helplessness and fear. Every hour that Aajan was in danger turned into a torturous wait for her family, intensifying their worst fears. In one of his emotional interviews, Aajan's brother, overcome with grief, spoke about the police's inaction, which led to the loss of critical days in the search for his sister. They felt time slipping away, and with every passing minute, a sense of hopelessness grew stronger. The perpetrator, realizing that no one was taking any active steps, continued his gruesome acts without fear or hesitation. He mercilessly disposed of Aajan's body, unaware that with every minute, her family was losing hope of ever seeing her alive again. A month after the tragedy, the family laid Aajan to rest with heavy hearts, knowing they would never have a proper goodbye. The closed zinc coffin became a haunting symbol of their fear and loss, and each of them wished they could see her one last time, feel her kindness, and experience the warmth she so generously shared with everyone around her. Their hearts were filled with bitterness and regret, as they now understood they had lost her bright eyes and genuine smile forever. The police, on their part, refused to admit any mistakes, insisting that all necessary measures had been taken promptly and on time. However, the facts told a different story. The delay at the start of the investigation only deepened the family's suffering, raising even more questions and frustration. Aajan's loved ones couldn't understand how their pain and fear could be so easily dismissed, knowing that time was working against them. This sense of helplessness and despair wasn't felt by the family alone. Aajan's friends also found themselves overwhelmed with anger and resentment toward a system that was supposed to protect them. When investigators finally began collecting evidence and conducting interviews, they encountered a barrage of rumors tarnishing Aajan's reputation. These accusations, spread by ill-wishers, turned out to be baseless, adding even more bitterness to her family's suffering. They knew their Aajan as a kind, compassionate, and bright individual, and couldn't believe that anyone could be capable of such cruelty toward her. Each new fact revealed only intensified their emotional pain, making them feel even more isolated and alone in their grief. The crime against Aajan Yalova left an indelible mark, not just on her family and friends, but on the entire community, becoming a tragedy that stirred the hearts of many. Aajan was a young, ambitious, and talented woman who aspired to develop her own brand and build a bright future full of hopes and dreams. She had plans that extended beyond her career, envisioning a personal life filled with happiness and achievements. But her life was cut short in the most tragic way, exposing deep-rooted systemic issues such as the negligence of law enforcement and the pervasive violence in society, demanding urgent attention and change. Aajan's family, in the midst of unbearable loss, painfully recognized that the police's inaction had cost them precious time. Her friends, remembering her with sorrow, couldn't help but notice how disturbingly cynical Tarabekov's social media page appeared. Even while in custody, he continued posting provocative messages. One of his statuses, "Smile at life, and it will surely smile back at you," was especially brazen given the crime he had committed. How could someone speak about the joy of life after taking it away from another person? These words only deepened the bitterness and sense of helplessness felt by everyone who knew Aajan and remembered her kindness, joyfulness, and sincerity. Aajan's brother, with deep sorrow in his heart, expressed his hope for justice in one of his emotional interviews. "I believe in the law of karma," he said with genuine conviction, confident that sooner or later everyone who commits evil will have to face the consequences of their actions. His words carried powerful emotion as he declared that, despite all the suffering, justice would eventually prevail. Even in the darkest moments of their lives, a spark of hope still burned, despite the darkness surrounding them. The criminal's motive remained unknown, but it was clear that what he did brought him some kind of twisted satisfaction. The trial of Tarabekov became a symbol of the fight for justice, drawing public attention and sparking widespread outrage. But for Aajan's family, it didn't change the fact that their beloved daughter and sister had been brutally taken from them. The case raised many questions about moral responsibility and the importance of being vigilant and aware of those around us, as such a tragedy could happen to anyone. The crime against Aajan was a grim reminder that every life is precious, and that we must do everything we can to prevent similar cases in the future. Let her story be a call to action, prompting stronger efforts to prevent violence and protect women's rights in society, urging all of us to reflect on how we can make the world a safer and more just place to live. In psychology, There is a special term called Adele syndrome, which refers to the morbid obsession of one person with another. The affliction received its name in honor of the youngest daughter of the famous French writer, Adele Hugo. She was a very attractive girl and a talented pianist, but unrequited love noticeably affected her mental state. As a result, the beauty simply poisoned the life of herself and her lover, who for years pursued, pretending to be his wife, then ruined his career and personal life. Unfortunately, 43 years of her 84 years, Adele spent in the walls of a psychiatric hospital. It is worth noting that the condition in which one person is overly interested in, or even obsessed with, another so much that he loses the ability to control his emotions, a fairly common phenomenon. In most cases, an experienced psychologist can help. Sometimes hospitalization and more thorough therapy are required, but sometimes such obsession borders on insanity, pushing a person to desperate, unpredictable, and extremely cruel actions. The case of Emma Ljungstig in 2008 shook the whole of Europe and became one of the most brutal in the history of Swedish forensic science. The perpetrator could be recognized as insane, and because of the lack of hard evidence, the case and even wanted to close, but he showed his true face in the courtroom. An immature young family, Emma Ljungstig was a native of Stockholm, where she was born on February 16, 1985, where almost all of her childhood and adolescence passed. She was brought up in a simple family where she was the younger of two daughters and grew up with her older sister, Katarina. At the age of 19, the girl married a young man named Nicholas, with whom she began dating while still in high school. The chosen one was not much older than the girl, and at the time of marriage the bride was already expecting a child. In 20 years, Emma first became a mother, giving birth to a son who was named Max, and a year and a half later she gave birth to a second child, a daughter, Saga. But, despite the appearance of two common heirs, the couple were still too young and were not ready for family life and the hardships of everyday life. They constantly quarreled over trifles, could not find a common language, and soon after the birth of their daughter, decided that they should separate. But then, the question of custody of children, which was solved very hard and painful. Nicholas sought not only to help the children financially, but also to take a direct part in their lives and upbringing. Emma was not against it, but soon she had a new romantic relationship. She moved to a small town called Arboga, located about 150 kilometers from Stockholm, to her new lover and took the children with her. The ex-husband was against it because he wanted to be able to see his daughter and son every day. Ex-spouses repeatedly met in court to settle the matter, and Nicholas even threatened Emma, which she immediately reported to the police. Problems could not be solved peacefully in any way, and each of the parents began to seek sole custody. New love. Emma met a guy named Torgny Hellberg through the internet. They quickly found a common language, got close, and a romantic relationship began between them. The young man was not confused by the fact that the 23-year-old girl already has two heirs from a previous marriage, because he had long dreamed of a family and was ready to accept them as his own children. The newly married couple first lived in a small house, which was inherited by Torgny by inheritance. But when the lovers decided to get married, they moved to a larger house, where they could live comfortably, and each of the children would have their own cozy room. The man at that time had a good job with a decent salary, and Emma was engaged in raising small children as well as creating a home, but, being a designer by education, was going to work in the future in the specialty. The couple planned to play a wedding in the summer of 2008, but these plans were not destined to fulfill. Brutal massacre. March 17, 2008 was an ordinary Monday. Torgny went to work early in the morning and Emma stayed home with 3-year-old Max and 1.5-year-old Saga. In the evening, the girl was preparing dinner, waiting for her fiancé to return, and at the same time, she was chatting online with her sister Katarina, discussing a gift for their parents' upcoming wedding anniversary. At about 6:30 in the evening, Emma received a call from Torgny, warning her that he was late for work. He said they could start dinner without him. After the brief phone conversation, Emma continued with her household chores, fed the children, and then sat down at the computer again, continuing to text with her sister. At 07:07 p.m., their communication was abruptly interrupted, literally half a word. Katarina thought it was very strange, because she saw that her sister was typing a message to her, but for some reason never sent it. 5 minutes later, a worried Katarina called Emma, but she didn't pick up. Then she dialed Torgny's number to find out what had happened. The young man was on his way home from work and was just approaching the house, so he assured Katarina that everything was fine, that Emma was probably distracted by the kids, and that she would call her back as soon as she could. When the man arrived at the threshold, he was surprised to find that the front door was unlocked. When he went inside, he immediately noticed the mess, thinking that the children had made a mess while playing. But then he saw brown stains and stains on the floor, realizing with horror that it was blood. Hellberg called Emma and the children's names loudly several times, but no one responded. In the hallway on the floor, the man saw a strange object, thinking at first that it was a doll, because the figure was lying in a completely unnatural pose. As he got closer, however, he realized that it was Saga in a pool of her own blood. Her head and face were disfigured beyond recognition and turned into a bloody mess. A little farther away lay her brother in a similarly horrifying state, with a fractured skull. Their mother was also lying on the floor, covered in blood and in an unnatural posture. Her face was badly shattered and disfigured. It seemed that all of them were no longer showing signs of life. Shocked, Tony pulled out his cell phone with trembling hands and dialed the emergency number, reporting what had happened. At that moment, Emma shuddered and let out a loud, long groan. Police officers and paramedics immediately arrived on the scene and found a weak pulse in all three victims and quickly began resuscitation. The picture was horrifying. No one understood what kind of beast could do this to a young woman and her children. But saving their lives was the priority. So, first of all efforts were thrown at getting the victims of the attack to the nearest hospital for assistance. Fighting for lives and the beginning of the investigation. From the outset, the arriving paramedics expressed doubts about whether the victims could be brought to the hospital alive at all. However, all three were still alive when they arrived at the medical facility. All were diagnosed with open head injuries, with severe brain damage and extensive blood loss. No prognosis was given by the doctors, but only did the best they could. Max and Saga were in critical condition. Even if they had managed to save their lives, it was unlikely that they would have ever been able to even breathe on their own. The condition of their mother was assessed as very serious, but stable. The young woman was put into a medically induced coma and hooked up to life support machines, hoping her body could cope. While doctors were fighting for the lives of the victims, forensic experts were working at the scene, trying to find clues and reconstruct the picture of the crime. Inside the house, chaos reigned. Scattered belongings, blood on the floor and walls. Unfortunately, the medics left behind a lot of clutter, as well as moving certain items around to allow access to the victims. The floor where Emma, Max, and Saga were lying was literally trampled on, and now the medics had to figure out what footprints belonged to them and if the perpetrator's prints were there. Remarkably, the intruder had massacred the three victims at most in 13 minutes. Since the last message from Emma to her sister was sent at 07:07 p.m., and at 07:20 p.m. already received a call to the police from a frightened Torgny. That said, the brutality with which the perpetrator massacred them spoke of some personal motive and a deep dislike for the victims. The weapon of the crime was a blunt and heavy object, presumably a hammer, which the mysterious criminal used to bludgeon his victims with ferocity. However, nothing of the kind could not be found at the scene, from which the natural conclusion was that the perpetrator took it with him. First suspect. From the start, Hellberg was the prime suspect. He was not married to Emma and was not the father of her children, and therefore it was suggested that perhaps a domestic quarrel between the couple could turn into a bloodbath. The grief-stricken man was immediately questioned. but he had an ironclad alibi. Firstly, he was really late at work, which was confirmed by his boss and colleagues, and secondly, at the time of the brutal massacre of his loved ones, he was walking down the street and was caught on a number of CCTV cameras. Nevertheless, Torney was decided to take a detailed statement, as he might have seen or heard something important that could help in the investigation of the crime. However, he could not remember anything specific, for it was business as usual until he saw the mess and the bodies lying on the floor. The only thing that alerted him was the unlocked front door, which could indicate that Emma had let the criminal in. After questioning, the man was released. By then, he had already informed his fiancée's family, and Emma's parents immediately rushed to Arboga from Stockholm. Together, they went by car straight to the hospital to the victims, but on the way there, they learned from the news on the radio terrible news. Max and Saga died of their injuries without regaining consciousness. Ex-husband's revenge? The new suspect was Emma's ex-husband and father of the children, Nicholas. The couple had been divorced for more than a year and parted peacefully. They did not manage. They constantly quarreled, sued for custody of the children, and the man even threatened the ex-spouse, which she reported to the police. It seemed that everything fits. After the breakup of the young woman took the children and took them to another city to his new chosen one, and their father, not having achieved custody through the court on the grounds of hostility to Emma, decided to take a desperate step and in a fit of rage and crucified the heirs. Nicholas was immediately tracked down and taken into custody, but the man seemed crushed by the news of Max and Saga's deaths, sobbing and constantly asking if there was some mistake. When he was charged with what had happened, he was at first stunned and then began shouting that he would never hurt his children, whom he adored. When asked where Nicholas was at the time of the crime, he replied that he was away in another city, where he went on business for a day. It sounded strange, but soon his alibi was confirmed. The man was indeed 120 miles away from the crime scene when someone was massacring his ex-wife and children. Searching for clues and fearing for the life of the sole survivor, forensic investigators remained active at the scene, trying to find any clues, evidence, or traces of the attacker. But the perpetrator had obviously worn gloves and left no fingerprints. With traces of shoes, everything was much more difficult because the house was visited by a dozen doctors who rendered assistance and took out the victims. Now it was necessary to collect all the footprints there and to find out which of them did not belong to the medics, Torgny or the victims themselves. The law enforcers were afraid that the criminal, having learned that Emma had survived, might sneak into the hospital and finish what he had started. After all, she was a crucial witness, and in case she came to her senses and could testify, she would certainly give him away. Therefore, a 24-hour guard was posted outside Youngstig's room. At the same time, neighbors were interviewed in search of possible witnesses. One woman recalled that at around 05 in the evening, a stranger in black clothes was walking around Emma and Torney's house. She thought it was strange, but she could not see the man's face because it was hidden by a hood. However, the neighbor suggested that it could be a girl because the figure was short and fragile. The same figure in black clothes and with a hood on his head also got into the lens of the street surveillance camera, located on the store a couple of minutes' walk from the scene of the crime. It also appeared to law enforcement that the woman in the video was a short, frail-looking girl. But who was she, and why would she wish harm on Emma and her children? The recording decided to show Torgny and to find out his opinion about who the stranger could be and whether he has any assumptions about it. Already from the first frames, the man began to change in his face, turned pale, and then said that it could be his ex-girlfriend, 31-year-old Christina Schurer, although he could not say for sure. Who is Christina Schurer? Torgny's former sweetheart was born in Hanover, Germany in 1977. When she was still a child, her father left the family and practically stopped communicating with his daughter, which negatively affected her mental state and behavior. The girl grew up willful and purposeful, but had a complex character. As a teenager, She went to the United States on an exchange program and lived in New York for several years. The girl received a good education in the field of history and archaeology, traveled extensively throughout Europe, taking part in excavations and expeditions. In the summer of 2006, she went to Greece, to the island of Crete, where she got a job in one of the popular hotels as a tour guide. There in July came on vacation 26-year-old Torgny, who immediately attracted Christina. He also liked this smart, interesting, and educated girl with whom he had an affair from the first days of acquaintance. Schur at that time was 29 years old, but a small age difference did not embarrass the couple. Their connection lasted for a week while the guy was vacationing in the hotel, and after his departure they continued to communicate by phone and correspond on the internet. A few months later, Christina came to Hellberg in Sweden and literally asked to stay at his house. Even then, such behavior seemed to Torgny too intrusive and even tactless. So when Christina offered him a weekend trip to the mountains, he refused and sincerely hoped that this was the last time they would meet. But the girl continued to call, write, and insist on a new meeting. In January 2007, during a phone conversation, Torgny told Christina that everything was over between them and they should not meet again, but Christina pretended not to hear it. She continued to call, asking to come to visit him, and calling Torgny to go on vacation with her. In the spring of 2007, Christina again came to Sweden and began to literally stalk the former boyfriend. She persuaded him to resume their relationship, although he honestly admitted that he is already dating another. Then Christina said that during the previous visit, forgot in his house something of the things, and she needs to take them away. Torgny agreed, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, the former lover tried to seduce him, and having received a firm refusal, said that he will still regret. 3 months later, Christina returned again and began to apologize for her behavior, again persuading the guy to get together, but he rejected her, and in the evening she called, saying that she swallowed pills because she does not want to live without him. Hellberg called her an ambulance and also called her family, telling them about Christina's antics and advising them to see a psychiatrist. After Schur received the necessary care at the hospital, her mother took her away and placed her in a psychiatric hospital, where she spent more than a month. However, the treatment did not give much results, and the girl remained literally obsessed with her former lover, constantly thinking about how to get him back and inventing new reasons for meetings. In October 2007, Christina decided to move to Sweden and settled in the suburbs of Stockholm, where she rented an apartment with another girl. She started to pursue her ex-boyfriend again, and when she got to meet him, she told him that she had given birth to a son by him, but gave the child to a foster family. Torgny was shocked by this news, but what he was most interested in was when it had happened. The last time they had been intimate was more than a year ago, and after that, they had met 3 more times at different times, but Christine had shown no signs of pregnancy. She herself answered evasively, and each time added some new details. In January 2008, after a dozen unsuccessful attempts to meet with Torgny, Christina wrote him a message in which she told him that their son had been diagnosed with a certain hereditary disease, and now they should go to Germany together to see him. She also added that the child's adoptive father would contact him and give him the details. At this time, she and Emma were in the process of moving to a new home, and the girlfriend was aware of the whole story. She believed that Tony's ex-girlfriend was simply trying to lure him to Germany, and no son had ever existed. When Tony received a call from a man who introduced himself as the adoptive father of her and Christine's child, Tony, on Emma's advice, began to ask questions about when the boy was born, in which hospital it happened, and so on. The interlocutor was clearly annoyed, avoided answering in every possible way, and then, and after all, hung up the phone. So Hellberg finally came to the conclusion that no son never existed. Christine made up the whole story and asked someone from the acquaintances to play along. Christina's arrest and the search for evidence After learning such a convoluted story, detectives quickly found out where the new suspect lived and went to the address. The door was opened by her roommate, who told them that Christina had hurriedly packed her things the day before and said that she was going back to Germany. A check showed that the girl had indeed left the country, so now the Swedish police had to seek help from their German colleagues to arrest her. On March 20th, a warrant was issued for her arrest. When the suspect was arrested, she claimed that there had been a mistake and that she had nothing to do with the massacre. But after she was taken to Sweden on March 29th, she immediately requested a meeting with Torny, which was denied. She was completely calm, but periodically asked to meet or call her ex again. Christina's rented apartment was thoroughly searched, and her phone and laptop were seized for inspection. All her clothes were thoroughly checked, but no traces of blood were found there. By then, investigators had worked out which of the bloody shoe prints at the scene did not belong to the medics and family members, so it was determined to be athletic. And from the tread pattern, they even figured out the brand and appearance. The size matched the one worn by the suspect, but she herself claimed that she never had such a model of sneakers. However, this statement was quickly refuted, as the shoes were identified by her roommate. Much more interesting findings awaited detectives in Christina's laptop. It was full of photos of Torgny, both their joint, and those where the man was depicted alone or in the company of his new lover. Also, in a separate folder with a very unpleasant signature, contained pictures of Emma and her children, which the suspect copied from the rival's page in the social network. Scherer captioned each photo with insulting, threatening, and downright scary captions. In the recovered search history were found requests on how to commit a murder without leaving traces, how to hide traces of the crime, and how to divert suspicion from himself. Also in the notes, investigators found a plan of Emma and Torny's new home and notes that indicated when the man left for work and what time he returned, and some other notes regarding the family's daily routine. Interview with survivor. Emma's condition was stabilized, her vitals gradually began to improve, and towards the end of March, doctors decided to gradually bring her out of the medically induced coma. Upon awakening, she was still unable to speak because of the breathing tube, but her gaze was meaningful. It was clear that she recognized the relatives present in the room, but did not understand what had happened to her and how she had ended up in the hospital. As soon as the victim became a little stronger and was able to speak clearly, the police agreed to talk to her, but decided not to tell her what had happened to the children. And then it turned out that Emma had no memory of the events of that fateful day, and believed that she must have been in a car accident. She kept asking about the children and whether they were all right. At first, she was given evasive answers, but then her family and medical team decided that there was no point in withholding such information. When Emma was told about what had happened and that her babies were no longer alive, she became hysterical. The doctors had to sedate her, after which she fell asleep, and when she woke up, she did not remember the conversation and asked about the children again. This continued for several weeks, and during this time, the mother was told several times about the death of her daughter and son, but her brain apparently refused to accept this information, each time erasing it. After another month, Emma, accompanied by medics, decided to be brought to the scene. Once inside the house, she suddenly remembered everything. The young woman told how she was texting with her sister, setting the table, and the children were playing near her when there was a knock on the door. She opened the door and saw a dark, short female figure on the threshold, but when she asked what she wanted, she felt a sharp pain and her eyes went black. The figure skulked into the house, and the desperate mother, out of her last strength, tried to catch up with her to protect her children, but apparently fell in the hallway, where they tried to finish her off. The trial and the verdict. Christina continued to stubbornly deny her guilt. The weapon of the crime was never found, and almost all the evidence found was circumstantial, which gave her a high chance of getting away with it. However, Christina's roommate, when questioned, said that in March a hammer was missing from her toolkit. She produced the toolkit itself, and the investigation determined that the size and configuration of that brand of tool matched the murder weapon. But that evidence was also circumstantial. Detectives were able to find surveillance footage from a suburban bus station where Schurer had traveled 3 times in the week before the crime. She herself could not explain why she visited Arbuga so often, but apparently the girl came to keep an eye on her future victims. The suspect was also unable to explain why she was searching the internet for information on how to cover up the crime and why she was collecting photos of Emma and her children. On July 29, 2008, the trial over Christina, who was accused of double murder with particular cruelty as well as attempted murder, began. The defendant herself behaved more than strangely. Upon entering the courtroom, she smiled and began to wave her hand, greeting those present. When she was asked questions about the massacre and was shown gruesome footage of the crime scene with mutilated bodies, she suddenly laughed. This suggested that the defendant was insane, but the appointed psychiatric examination established that the girl was sane and perfectly aware of what was happening. Consequently, she enjoyed what she had done and did not even try to hide it. When Emma was in the courtroom and saw Christina there, she fainted. When she was brought to her senses, she said that she finally remembered everything, and this face was the last thing she saw on that fateful day. Despite the defense lawyer's attempts to prove her client's innocence, the jury unanimously found her guilty on all counts. Christina was sentenced to life in prison with no right to ever be released. She was also ordered to pay 20,000 euros in compensation to Emma. No evidence was found that Christina had ever been pregnant and had given birth to a son by Torgny. As for young Stig, her recovery process was long and arduous, but Torgny did not abandon his beloved. They were married in the summer of 2010. The couple are now raising 2 common heirs who know the sad story of their older brother and sister. Imagine that today we will visit a Hollywood movie studio where they shoot the best movies in the world of different genres. But instead of a movie pavilion, we will find ourselves in Wilbur, Nebraska, and our movie for today is a bloody thriller. Nebraska is the territory of the Great Plains. It is located in Tornado Alley. In spring and summer, there are often severe thunderstorms and tornadoes. Nebraska is the only tri-state that is landlocked, which means to get from Nebraska to the ocean, bay, you have to cross 3 states. Passing motorists don't like to stop on a dark country road. But a flat tire forced Michael to make a stop on a remote dark highway. He pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. As he walked around the car, his attention was drawn to a large black bag, the kind used for throwing out garbage, but the bag had an unusual shape. Michael returned to the car, took a flashlight from the glove compartment, and illuminated the bag. It was torn open. There was a stain on the ground around it. Something had leaped out of it, and something light-colored was flickering out of the holes. Moving closer, the man froze at what he saw. A human hand was sticking out of the bag. A call to the emergency services raised the whole town. A few minutes later, investigators arrived on the country highway and thoroughly inspected the area. They confirmed that the package they found contained human remains. The package was sent for examination, and the searchers continued to comb the surrounding area. The recovered remains were soon identified. The victim was 24-year-old Cindy Loof. Sydney Irene Luff was born on August 21, 1993 in Broken Bow, Nebraska. She grew up in Arcadia with her parents George and Susie Luff. Sydney's family moved to Neelai in 2000, at which time she was in 2nd grade. Her mother Susie was a special education teacher, and her father George was the school principal. Sydney was always a very active child. The girl had a normal, happy childhood filled with a love of nature. She loved fishing, which her father always took her to. During her school years, Cindy played basketball and golf, where she made good progress, but developed scoliosis, curvature of the spine, forced to give up many of her favorite hobbies and put a cross on her sports career. In 2011, after graduating from high school,
Sydney got a job at a local Menards store that specialized in home improvement products. The Loofs were a close-knit family, and when Sydney had to move from Norfolk to Lincoln because of work, they all made sure to keep in touch almost every day and often met for dinner. Even though Sydney lived separately, she often returned home to her parents' house. But lately, Sydney had been struggling with depression and felt that the medications she was taking were only making things worse. Susie was very worried about her daughter and recommended a new doctor for her. He prescribed her various medications. In phone conversations with her mom, Sydney told how her inner state was getting back to normal, her voice sounding quite optimistic. She was trying to make some changes in her life and was looking for a new job. For a young woman, working in a store was not the limit of her dreams. She did not know what she wanted to become or what to do with her career, and these worries led to a rather depressive state. In November 2017, her mental state deteriorated to the point where she started taking antidepressants and sometimes allowed herself to smoke pot. Her family and friends were supportive in every way possible, but she wanted not only companionship, but also love. Being young and modern, Sydney had an interest in the female gender, so she would sometimes look for other girls on social media for dating purposes. To find a friend, Sydney used Tinder, an app that allows millions of people around the world to find, fall in love, and date. In November 2017, she found a girl named Audrey, and the girl replied to her. They began to correspond. The girls found many common interests, such as gambling, hiking, and delicious food. Already after 100 messages, they decided to meet. On November 14th, Sydney headed over to Audrey's house to Wilbur. Their first meeting went so well that Sydney was very happy. They liked each other and agreed to meet again at Audrey's house. On November 15th, Sydney worked her shift at the store and went home. She cleaned herself up, styled her hair, and did her makeup. Before going out, she took a photo and posted it on Tinder with the caption, "Ready for my date." After the photo, she got a message to go out, with Audrey waiting for her in the car. The girls drove off. The next day, Sydney Loof didn't show up for work. But even though she had been in high spirits for the past few days because of her new acquaintance, her family was concerned when co-workers informed them that she didn't show up for work because it was nothing like their responsible Sydney. Susie spoke of her daughter suffering from anxiety and deep depression. Just days before her disappearance, Loof had discussed her deteriorating mental health with her family, who advised her to see a doctor again to take antidepressants. That was the last time Loof's family saw Sydney. The girl's parents went to her apartment and were extremely surprised that Sydney had left her favorite cat Mimsy without food or water. This was extremely unlike a caring landlady. The parents knew how much Sydney loved her cat and never left her alone for long. They were concerned and reported Sydney missing to the police. The apartment itself was locked. When the police did a welfare check of Sydney's home, they saw nothing out of the ordinary. But the family was adamant. Something was wrong, and the police took their concerns seriously. On November 16, 2017, the 5'7" blonde was reported missing after she failed to show up at the showroom of the Menards store where she worked, at 27th Street and Cornhusker Highway. Sydney suffered from a spinal condition and walked in a different way that would make her stand out from the crowd. She was wearing a white Columbia brand jacket and a cream-colored shirt. When testifying about the prior events before she went missing, her parents told police that she told her friend on Snapchat Wednesday morning that she had gone on a date with a woman she met online Tuesday night and planned to meet up with her again Wednesday night. Sydney's car, which she left in northeast Lincoln, was found. Police officers said they have conducted interviews and were looking for any leads that could lead to Sydney or her trail. Loof's family distributed flyers saying she may have been abducted 40 miles southwest of Lincoln, where the latest information indicated her cell phone was communicating with a tower. The flyer also noted that there was no activity in her bank account and that her cell phone was turned off the night she disappeared. The flyers gave a description of the young woman and distinguishing features such as several tattoos, one on her arm with the words "Everything will be great someday," a yin-yang sign under her elbow and the word "believe" on her wrist. Anyone with information on Sydney Loof's whereabouts has been asked to contact police by phone. A huge appeal to find Sydney was launched, which included highway billboards with the girl's picture, and a manhunt was also launched on the TV news. Susie persisted in claiming that something had happened to Sydney after the date her daughter had gone on. To prove her point, she took a screenshot of a post that Sydney posted on Snapchat with her picture and the caption, "Ready for my date." Sydney's friends confirmed that she was going on a date with a woman she met through Tinder named Audrey. During the search, police reviewed Sydney's phone records and surveillance footage from the store where she worked and quickly identified the person they wanted to talk to. The last time Sydney's phone rang a cell tower in the Wilbur neighborhood, probably not far from Audrey's home, but police had no idea who she was. Authorities began searching for a woman named Audrey, the last person to see Sydney alive, but no one knew how to find her because no one knew who she was or if she had a real name. To the police's rescue came Sydney's friend Brooklyn, who decided to find Audrey herself through Tinder. She downloaded the app, found Audrey, and exchanged phone numbers with her. That's how police learned Audrey's real name. She turned out to be 26-year-old Bailey Boswell. It turned out that Bailey's apartment is within reach of the very cell tower where Sydney's phone was last seen connected to the tower. It also became known that this apartment Bailey shared with her partner, 52-year-old Aubrey Trail. So who are Bailey and Aubrey? Bailey Boswell grew up in Lyons, Iowa. She grew up in a wholesome, normal family, was a friendly kid, and did well in school. Bailey had success in basketball and was an excellent runner. However, after losing her father, her life changed direction, and after graduating from high school, Bailey went down the wrong path. Bad company, alcohol, and illicit drugs came into her life. On one of the dating websites, she met Aubrey after a looking for a daddy status. Aubrey Trail had a depressing past. He had multiple fraud charges, fraudulent check fraud, and theft. Aubrey created his own cult where he called himself the Vampire Daddy. He paid women $200 a week to follow his rules. The rules were strange enough, but there were women who believed Aubrey. At the time of Sydney's disappearance, Aubrey and Bailey were ordered by the court to pay over $400,000 for fraud. They also had numerous misdemeanors on the two of them, but the couple managed to go on the run. On November 19, 2017, after obtaining a warrant, police searched Bailey and Aubrey's home. An inspection of the apartment revealed that some of the walls had been scrubbed with bleach, which was confirmed by a neighbor who had noticed the acrid smell of chlorinated substances 2 days earlier. Police actively began searching for the suspects. While on the run, they posted videos on Facebook saying they had no involvement in Sydney's disappearance and hoped for her safe return. Bailey claimed she went on 2 dates with Sydney, but dropped her off at a friend's house and never heard from her again. She said, "I just want Sydney's family to know that I'm really sorry, but I had nothing to do with it. I hope Sydney is found very soon. She's a lovely, amazing girl." It took police a few days to track down the couple, but they eventually found them at a hotel in Branson, Missouri. Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail were taken into custody. A few weeks after Sydney was reported missing, after carefully analyzing phone records and Bailey's location records, police discovered Sydney's remains. She had been dismembered. Her body had been cut into 14 pieces, and police found 13 of her body parts in black plastic garbage bags in ditches in Clay County. Some of her organs, including her heart, were missing. This is just horrific. A total of 16 crime scenes were found with Sydney's remains or personal belongings. Her car keys, driver's license, phone case were found along the highway. All the routes matched the movements of the two perpetrators. Forensics conducted autopsies on 13 body parts that were found. There were abrasions on Sydney's wrists, a bump on her head, torn earlobes, abrasions and contusions on her back. There were wounds on her body indicating that Sydney had fought for her life. The heartbreaking discovery shocked not only Sydney Loof's family and friends, but all of Nebraska. On December 11, 2017, the Loof family held a private funeral for Sydney at the Lutheran church the girl attended during her lifetime. Bailey and Aubrey were charged with first-degree murder, improper disposal of human remains, and conspiracy to commit a felony. Bailey pleaded not guilty to all three charges. Aubrey also pleaded not guilty to felony murder and conspiracy, but pleaded guilty to improper disposal of human remains. Each successive deposition of Aubrey differed from the previous one. The man was constantly confused, changing the course of action and adding different actors. When Aubrey first talked to the police after his arrest, he told them about the cult he and Bailey were involved in. He talked about witchcraft and told them that he was a vampire who could fly. Aubrey portrayed himself as the leader of this cult and a vampire, and assured them that he had witches in the cult who had to kill another woman to get powers. So at one of his first court hearings, he admitted that he killed Sydney Loof, but did it completely by accident. He said that he paid her $5,000 to fulfill his intimate fantasy with two other women. Sydney agreed, but died accidentally during the intimate act when he accidentally strangled her with a cord. He also admitted that he disposed of the body by cutting her into pieces, as it was a ritual in accordance with his religious beliefs. He had to drain all the blood to release her soul to the gods in a sacred place and lay out her body parts to help her reincarnate faster. But this version turned out to be false. Surveillance footage provided, dated November 14th, shows Bailey and Aubrey checking into a hotel in Lincoln, not far from where Sydney lives. And then, on November 15th, they visit a home improvement store, which shows them buying a gruesome array of tools: a hacksaw, chlorine bleach, a folding saw, a stationery knife, and the bags used for Sydney's remains. On November 15th at 12:01 in the afternoon, a surveillance camera captured Sydney crossing paths with Aubrey at the Menards store during business hours. But the girl had no idea at the time who he was or how cruelly fate would play her. On June 11th, 2018, the first court hearing was held for the murder and improper burial of Sydney Loof's remains. Separate trials were ordered, but the charge was essentially the same for both. The trials were held in Lexington because attorneys argued that Bailey and Aubrey would not get a fair trial in Wilbur because of the publicity surrounding the case. The prosecution argued that Sydney was murdered. She was strangled, and the crime was a premeditated attack that was carefully planned. Aubrey and Bailey were declared ringleaders of a group that was interested in recruiting young women for intimate games. Bailey therefore used Tinder to find the women. At trial, the jury heard testimony from 3 other women who said they had been in relationships with Aubrey and Bailey at different times, and their acquaintance also began on Tinder. All of them had been involved with Bailey and had participated in intimate acts with Bailey and Aubrey. One woman said she even traveled with them after they met. She said Aubrey gave her a weekly allowance of $200 and invited her to join his cult. He called the cult members witches and said she had to torture and kill someone to join them. She testified that Bailey was called a witch queen. Another woman testified that Bailey talked in great detail about breaking her fingers and her desire to dismember the body. She liked to talk about torture. All 3 women who testified made it clear that both Bailey and Aubrey were involved in all the talk about torture and the crime. It is quite strange that in our modern world, there are still people who believe in the horrors of exorcism and try to assure the rest of us that they do. Talking about the investigation and the evidence obtained, the prosecution reconstructed the picture of what happened on the tragic evening of November 15, 2017. Sydney was getting ready for a date with a woman she had known for a couple days. They texted on Tinder and Bailey picked Sydney up from her apartment. They went for a ride in Bailey's car. After a while, the car stopped at Bailey's house, where Sydney was lured into the apartment. There, Bailey and Aubrey pounced on her as soon as she went inside and strangled her with an extension cord on the living room floor. The apartment was then thoroughly cleaned out by Bailey and Aubrey, a part the prosecution alleged was also pre-planned. They then cut Sydney into pieces and dumped her remains in Clay County the next day, November 16th. The court heard from their landlord, Jennifer Call, who testified that on November 16th, as soon as she drove into the garage. She smelled chlorine, and the odor intensified when she entered the house. According to the medical examiner's testimony, Sydney's death was ruled a homicide, and the cause of death was asphyxiation. Toxicology reports indicated that Sydney had antidepressants in her system. The court learned that in addition to the missing organs, the part of Sydney's body that was not found was her upper left arm, the part just above the elbow and below the shoulder. Prosecutors had demanded the death penalty for both criminals, and the case would be retried if the sentence was unjust. But Aubrey, once again, denied involvement in the occult and pleaded guilty only to improperly burying the remains. At one point during Aubrey's trial, he shouted that Bailey had nothing to do with Sydney's death. "Bailey is innocent, damn you all." He then slashed his throat 3 times with a razor blade. He survived and was remanded into custody until he made a full recovery. After that, he did not attend court for several weeks. The next time he entered the courtroom was during the defense phase and only when he was scheduled to testify. When he was brought into court, he smirked and told the judge, "I'll be good." It is unusual for a defendant to testify at his own trial. Usually, defense attorneys advise the defendant not to testify because it may cause more problems for him on cross-examination. Some reveal too much, some can't answer questions straightforwardly, and some are hostile to attorneys asking questions, which creates a bad impression for jurors. But this was not unusual in Aubrey's case, as he had many interactions with police after his arrest. He had given the police his version of events, and at trial, he wanted to change his story. Therefore, the court needed to hear his new version of events. He decided to skip the rest of the trial and only returned for the last hearing with his horrible scars clearly visible when he testified in his defense. Aubrey Trail took the stand and shocked his attorneys by admitting that he had previously lied to authorities and his own legal team about the death of Sydney Loof. In a new version of the testimony he gave, he admitted that they met with Sydney in March 2017 and he paid her to participate in his illegal activities because she needed the money. He said they did not keep in touch, but in November 2017, Bailey wanted to rekindle the relationship and she contacted Sydney again. Sydney needed money, and Aubrey said that's why he was in Menards that day, November 15th. He offered her $5,000 to be part of his antique gang. The 3 of them ended up engaging in an intimate act later that night, and Sydney accidentally choked to death because of the extension cord they used in their games. "I don't know if Sydney had a seizure or something, but that's when she stopped breathing," said Aubrey. He told the court that there was no ritual involved in cutting up Sydney's body, and all the talk of witches, vampires, and blood-sucking was simply not true. He confessed that he only dismembered her because he couldn't put her body in the car. He said he panicked and dumped her body in a Clay County field as soon as dawn broke on the morning of November 16th. When asked why he didn't seek help if her death was accidental, he said no one would believe him. Aubrey admitted to disposing of Sydney's body, but claimed her death was accidental when they used an extension cord during their games. At Bailey's trial, she admitted to nothing. In fact, her attorneys argued that she was also victimized by Aubrey. Her attorney told the court that when she met Aubrey, she was a vulnerable young woman. At the time, she was living alone, working as a waitress in Princeton, Missouri. The defense argued that Bailey had nothing to do with either Sydney's death or the disposition of her remains, but that again proved to be false. The cell phone that Bailey used to access her Tinder account was used near where Sydney's body parts were found, and it was through a detailed analysis of her phone and location records that the police were able to find all of Sydney's remains. The court also learned that it was Bailey who contacted Sydney and arranged to meet her. She was the one who drove to Sydney's duplex to pick her up on the evening of November 15th. The prosecution told the court that Bailey derived satisfaction from discussing acts of cruelty, and she enjoyed talking about torture with Aubrey. Evidence was presented at trial proving a planned crime. On the day Sydney was killed, Aubrey and Bailey were together at a store where they bought tools, including a hacksaw, scissors, and a box cutter from Home Depot. Around noon that day, Bailey sent Sydney a text message asking how her day was going. Phone records and surveillance footage show that Bailey was in the Menards parking lot with Aubrey when she sent that text message on Tinder. And although Sydney worked at Menards, it appears she was unaware that Bailey was there. A few hours later, Bailey sent Sydney another message on Tinder, alerting her that she was at her apartment and ready to pick her up soon. Phone records indicate that instead of going on a date, as Sydney believed, they went to the apartment where Bailey and Aubrey lived. Bailey's attorney, Todd Lancaster, argued that as to Bailey, the evidence showed that Bailey was guilty of purchasing bleach and garbage bags to use to dispose of Sydney's body, and, as such, she could be charged with aiding and abetting the improper disposal of human remains. On November 8, 2021, Bailey Boswell was sentenced to life in prison. The Loof family had been seeking justice for 3 years, mourning and longing for their Sydney, and they awaited a judgment that gave them comfort. On July 11, 2019, it took a jury less than 3 hours to find Aubrey Trail guilty of premeditated conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and improper burial of human remains. The 3-judge panel called his crime cold and calculated. In a second phase of the trial to determine whether he should be executed, county prosecutors kept their promise and secured the death penalty for Aubrey Trail. Thus, on June 9, 2021, Aubrey Trail was executed by lethal injection. The con man, accused of a brutal crime against Nebraska woman Sydney Loof, allegedly convinced members of his cult that he was a flying, mind-reading vampire with a coven of a dozen witches who he claimed would get their powers by killing people. But thankfully, in real-life stories, justice prevails, and in our story, the trial brought the monster to the end of his trail in our world.
Imagine a quiet, close-knit community where everyone seems to know each other, and crime is a rare occurrence. Sarah Starr, a teacher, a caring mother, and a dedicated member of her local church, was always smiling, always attentive to those around her. But one morning, she simply vanished, and just a few hours later, she was found lifeless in her own driveway. 2 shots from a shotgun ended her life in an instant. But here's the strange part. The main suspect was her ex-husband, Jason. Witnesses claimed he had threatened her, but he insisted on his innocence, even presenting a rock-solid alibi. So what's really going on here? Could someone else have been involved in this tragic twist of fate? Why did the authorities continue to suspect him despite the lack of direct evidence? Today, we'll dive into a complex investigation that spanned several years. You'll discover the secrets hidden behind the facade of this seemingly perfect town and learn just how far desperation and a thirst for revenge can push someone. Are you ready to uncover the truth about what really happened to Sarah Starr? It all started on November 27, 2017. On a sunny morning around 9 a.m., the emergency services of Coffee County, Alabama, received a distressing call. The man on the line spoke calmly, but his words left no doubt. He reported that his acquaintance, Sarah Starr, had likely taken her own life. Officers immediately rushed to the scene, a small house owned by the local church. This house, originally built to house the pastor, had been rented out for years only to church members. Sarah Starr, a woman with a complicated past, had been living there under special terms provided by the church. The home had become her refuge after enduring a 2-year-long divorce process, leaving her alone with her 4 children. She was 38 years old, trying to start fresh, far from the painful memories and conflicts of her past. Sarah was born in the small town of Colby, Kansas, in 1979. People always saw her as talented and caring, especially when it came to children. She chose to become a teacher, graduating from college and starting her career at a local school. Teaching literature and writing, she easily connected with her students, and many described her as a positive and attentive educator. Her marriage to Jason began back in 2001. At that time, she was 22 and had just earned her bachelor's degree in education. Jason was 6 years older and had recently returned from the military. Their relationship seemed harmonious. Both dreamed of building a family and appeared to be happy, but as is often the case, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. At first, their marriage seemed peaceful. The couple settled in Colby, where they welcomed a set of twins, followed by another set 5 years later. However, Jason struggled with the responsibilities of fatherhood. He became increasingly irritable, snapping at Sarah over the noise of the kids, the constant mess, and lack of sleep. With each passing year, his frustrations grew more pronounced, and he didn't hesitate to belittle her, even in front of others. Sarah tried to keep the peace, finding solace in her faith. She became a devoted member of the local Baptist church, which gradually became her second home. With her gentle nature and outgoing personality, she quickly made new friends. Sarah took up gardening and photography, immersing herself in hobbies to distract from the turmoil at home. In 2016, when her life seemed to be on steadier ground, Sarah started working as a fourth-grade teacher. She continued to be seen as a caring and friendly person, but behind that warm exterior lay hidden struggles. Jason, growing increasingly resentful of his role as a father of 4, became more aggressive, and the tension in their marriage escalated. After numerous attempts to save their relationship, Sarah finally decided to file for divorce. She moved out, leaving the house to Jason, and found refuge in a home offered by the church. Relocating to Alabama appeared to be her opportunity for a fresh start. However, the divorce process dragged on, and her financial situation worsened. According to Jason, Sarah began spending recklessly, which only added to her troubles. The move was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter for her, but it didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped. On the day she left Jason's house, Sarah invited 2 close friends, Dana and Lawrence, to help her with the move. They recalled how she was frantic, running around, forgetting things, and repeatedly going back and forth. Sarah's behavior seemed unstable, and Dana and Lawrence sensed she was afraid of something. Her main concern was that Jason might show up and cause trouble. And her fears weren't unfounded. Now a single mother, Sarah felt her life becoming increasingly difficult. Despite the support of her church, the loneliness and financial burdens weighed heavily on her. When Sarah and her children finally arrived at the new house provided by the church, Jason did indeed show up. He approached the front door, but Lawrence stood his ground, blocking him from entering. Sensing that confrontation wouldn't work in his favor, Jason eventually left. However, according to Lawrence, Sarah's reaction was as if she had seen a ghost. She was shaking and crying. She insisted that Jason had threatened her, and now her worst fears had come true. 2 years after that incident, the divorce process finally concluded. The court ruled that the children would be under shared custody between both parents. Jason was ordered to pay child and spousal support to Sarah, which significantly impacted his financial situation. He had to give up more than half of his income. Sarah continued living in the church-provided home, while Jason moved to another house nearby, where he stayed with his mother. The morning of November 27, 2017, started like any other, except for one crucial difference. Sarah didn't show up for work. Her colleagues, who knew her as an extremely punctual and responsible person, were immediately concerned. Sarah wasn't answering calls or reading messages, and her absence seemed completely out of character. One of her colleagues, worried, drove over to Sarah's house to check if everything was okay. When her colleague arrived, she found Sarah's lifeless body on the driveway. Several gunshot wounds, blood, all pointed to a violent act. Emergency services were called right away, but it was already too late for Sarah. The police arrived on the scene and initially considered the possibility of self-harm. But after examining the crime scene, they quickly realized this was an act of aggression. As it was later revealed, the shots were fired around 6:30 a.m. when Sarah was leaving her house. An unknown assailant, armed with a shotgun, had been waiting for her and fired at close range. The first shot hit her chest, and the second, her head. Neighbors heard the shots, but they didn't think much of it. In the rural area where hunters were common, such sounds weren't unusual. No one imagined they were hearing Sarah's final moments. Forensics experts arrived at the scene but found no fingerprints or tire tracks. The perpetrator had been careful. However, knowing about the recent divorce and the tense relationship between Sarah and her ex-husband, the police's suspicions naturally turned toward Jason. The first people detectives spoke with were Sarah's friends. Dana and Lawrence. They confirmed that the last few months had been particularly hard for Sarah. She often expressed her fear of Jason and even suggested that he might go to extreme lengths to get back at her. Their statements added tension to the investigation. Sarah's ex-husband, Jason, lived just a few minutes' walk from her home, giving him enough time to arrive there in the early morning and leave undetected afterward. Detectives, suspicious of Jason, continued to dig into the sequence of events, increasingly focusing on his potential involvement. However, when they brought him in for questioning, Jason insisted on his innocence, claiming that he was having breakfast at a cafe with his kids at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage and witness testimonies backed up his alibi, yet the detectives remained reluctant to rule him out. His motives were clear: a messy divorce, child support, and financial obligations that had become a major strain on his budget. Sarah's friends and family repeatedly told police that she was afraid of Jason. They were convinced that if anyone could have gone to such extremes, it was him. However, the police had no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Several press conferences were held, with authorities urging the public to come forward with any information that might help solve the case. The state's governor even announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator, and a local resident added another $500 to the sum. Despite the police's efforts and widespread publicity, the investigation stalled. The case went cold for several years, and it wasn't until December 2021 that detectives regained momentum after receiving new information. They became convinced that Jason might have been involved indirectly, possibly by hiring someone to carry out the crime. He had a strong motive. After the divorce, he was required to pay child support that amounted to more than half of his income, which had become a serious financial burden. When detectives began examining Jason's digital records, they found something curious on his computer, notes that he seemed to be writing as if for a book. In these entries, he detailed his thoughts about his relationship with Sarah, the perceived injustice of the court's decision, and his resentment toward paying child support. The texts contained derogatory remarks about women, further deepening the police's suspicions. The detectives also reviewed his financial transactions leading up to the crime and uncovered several unusual payments. Between September 7th and November 15th, 2017, Jason transferred $2,600 to a woman named Lily. It turned out she was a friend of Jason's brother, Darren. What made this even more suspicious was that no previous transfers had ever taken place between them, and according to Lily, they barely knew each other until then. When detectives questioned Lily, they discovered that Jason had given his brother a 2016 motorcycle, an expensive vehicle, supposedly for repairs after an accident. He claimed the bike needed major work, costing around $5,000, and arranged to send money to his brother through Lily in small amounts. This struck detectives as odd. Why would Jason, who was already struggling financially, suddenly decide to gift his brother such an expensive item? And why was he using Lily, a woman he barely knew, to facilitate these transactions? Detectives suspected that Jason and Darren might have been disguising these payments as repair costs, but they could have actually been payments related to the crime. They began closely monitoring Darren. Darren, a rough and solitary man, had lived most of his life in a trailer in Texas and kept to himself. He'd had past run-ins with the law, once for speeding, during which he was found with illegal substances. The detectives decided to check the brothers' communications, including text messages and phone calls. They seized their phones and uncovered some crucial details. It turned out that before Thanksgiving 2017, Darren had indeed traveled to Coffee County, Alabama. He arrived on November 18th and stayed in the area for 10 days, with his phone frequently pinging near Sarah's house. The night before the crime, his phone was switched off around midnight, which raised suspicions. It wasn't turned back on until 10 a.m. the next morning, by which time he was already back in Texas. This suggested that Darren might have deliberately tried to hide his whereabouts during the time of the crime. That same day, in the evening, Darren sent Jason a text message that appeared coded. He mentioned a successful deer hunt. Police believe the brothers were using coded language to communicate. One of Sarah's neighbors recalled seeing a motorcycle matching Darren's near Sarah's home. This distinctive bike had been spotted by other residents in the area before the incident, but no one thought much of it at the time. Another critical piece of evidence emerged when detectives reviewed footage from a surveillance camera on a shed near Sarah's home. The camera captured a motorcycle, matching Darren's bike's description, leaving the area just minutes after the gunshots were heard. December 2021 became a turning point in the investigation. Armed with enough evidence, the police charged Jason and his brother Darren, suspecting them of conspiring to commit a crime. Jason was arrested first, and despite his defiant attitude and loud claims of innocence, he quickly requested a lawyer. However, his confidence was short-lived. Shortly after interrogations, he unexpectedly confessed to Sarah's death. Despite this confession, he was released on bail with the condition of wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet. When Darren learned of his brother's arrest, he went on the run. The police and FBI launched a manhunt, placing him on the most wanted list. An initial reward of $10,000 was offered for information leading to his capture, which was later increased to $22,000. Nearly 2 months later, on February 5, 2022, Darren turned himself in Texas. He denied any involvement, and unlike Jason, he refused to post bail, choosing instead to remain in jail until the trial. The hearings dragged on for months due to the abundance of circumstantial evidence and the lack of direct proof. Darren's attorney argued that there were no physical traces linking his client to the crime scene. He pointed out that the weapon used in the crime was never found, and that the surveillance footage was too unclear for a positive identification. He also emphasized that the absence of fingerprints and motorcycle tire tracks weakened the prosecution's case. In response, the prosecution presented evidence of the transactions between Jason and Lily, highlighting the financial transfers made in the months before and after the crime. They argued that these payments were for services rendered, and that the motorcycle given to Darren was used for the trip to Alabama. A crucial piece of evidence was the surveillance footage from the shed, which showed a motorcycle matching Darren's leaving the scene shortly after the crime. The prosecution insisted that the brothers used Lily to transfer money to conceal their tracks. When questioned in court, Lily stated that she was unaware of the brothers' intentions and was simply following their requests. All charges against her were eventually dropped, but her testimony played a key role in building the case against the brothers. The trial lasted several days, with each side attempting to sway the jury. Jason's lawyer emphasized the restaurant footage showing Jason with his children at the time of the crime as solid proof of his alibi. He also highlighted that Jason had voluntarily handed over his phone and computer to the police, which, he argued, was not typical behavior for someone trying to hide their involvement. Despite the defense's efforts, Jason's own confession, combined with the collected circumstantial evidence, convinced the jury. After 6 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found both brothers guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. On January 4th, 2024, Jason and Darren were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This verdict was seen as a form of mercy, as the nature of the crime could have led to the death penalty, but the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on that outcome. Jason has also been ordered to pay a fine of $25,000. Darren's attorney announced plans to appeal the verdict, while Jason's defense team opted not to, given his confession. As for the Starr children, Sarah's parents have taken custody. During the trial, the older twins publicly renounced their father, stating they no longer wanted any contact with him. Both brothers remain in federal prison, and there is currently no confirmed information about the status or outcome of any potential appeals. This story is not just about jealousy and family conflicts. It's a reminder of how financial and emotional issues can spiral into tragedy. The most heartbreaking part is that the innocent children, whom Jason was supposed to protect, lost their mother at the hands of their own father and uncle. This case highlights the importance of recognizing signs of aggression and manipulation in relationships, and the painful reality that sometimes those closest to us can be more dangerous than we realize. Stories like this one prompt us to ask, how well do we truly know the people around us? Perhaps you or someone close to you is in a challenging relationship right now. Never ignore warning signs, because unfortunately, a story like Sarah's could happen to anyone. Take care of yourself, don't be afraid to seek help, and pay attention to the well-being of those you love. It's crucial to remember that even those we trust the most can pose a threat, and this case is a stark reminder of that. What are your thoughts on what happened? Can financial pressure and resentment ever justify such a monstrous act? Share your thoughts below and tell us how you would handle a similar situation if you ever found yourself in one.
Wedding travel, or as it is also called, honeymoon, an event is definitely important in the life of a young family. It can be a bright impressions received from an unforgettable adventure, or for example, a long-awaited vacation from boring life, somewhere on the Azure coast under the shade of palm trees. But what about when you go on your wedding trip only to commit a real crime, or not to commit it, but only to be accused of it? Would the honeymoon be as bright and carefree in such a case? I don't think so. Unforgettable, of course. Isabella Rodriguez, hereafter Hellman, was born in 1975 in Colombia. It is a country where everyone speaks only Spanish, but Isabella literally dreamed the American dream. She bought books in English, listened to songs on the radio, and all just to learn the language and as soon as possible to leave to conquer the northern part of the continent. However, the language to learn Isabella succeeded, but the southern accent remained with her forever. But this did not prevent the young woman to move to Florida, get a job there as a real estate agent, and help in renting or buying homes like her people who speak only Spanish. In 2002, Isabella, although not to say that she was lucky, but still married William Hellman. And despite the fact that the couple lived in marriage for 10 years, their entire union, a series of continuous quarrels and domestic disputes. Finally, when the patience of the spouses finally burst, they filed for divorce. The divorce process lasted a very long time, as long as 2 years. During these 2 years, Isabella even managed to find a new man, with whom, as it seemed to her, she will certainly find happiness. The new lover's name was Lewis Bennett, and he was from Great Britain. As a child, his family moved to live in Australia, thanks to which Lewis received dual citizenship and was able to return to his native country and graduate their quite prestigious Canborne School of Mines. But Lewis never managed to work in his specialty. It is impossible to say whether this is good or bad, because just a couple of years after graduating in the UK, he returned to Australia and opened his own solar panel manufacturing company. And it is worth noting that it was quite successful, because just 4 years later, he was able to enter the American market. And in view of the fact that his main office was in Florida, the young and promising Lewis began to look for a wife there via the internet. It would seem that today, it is easy to get acquainted with someone on the internet, and much easier than to do it in person. But Lewis had no luck with this for a long time. He flipped through the profiles of women, not even paying much attention to them. Those who wrote to him first either scared him off or did not arouse his interest. But when he saw Isabella in the photo, she seemed to him a copy of Jennifer Lopez, and he decided to write to her. It should be noted that they corresponded for quite a long time and very often. Isabella told him about how she always wanted to move to America from Colombia, how long she had been learning the language, how she was looking for a job, and finally, she even confided in him and told him about her past relationships. Bennett was not at all embarrassed by this, especially since Isabella and William's divorce is only a matter of time. As for the young woman herself, she was apparently tired of past relationships and the long divorce, which ate up all the inner strength. She herself took the initiative to meet in person and began to come to Lewis wherever he was, whether it was England, Australia, or even Thailand. And Lewis, trying to strike his new lover, bought a catamaran, on which he planned to travel the Caribbean Sea with Isabella. It was his childhood dream, because of frequent moves, quickly find new friends could not manage and had to spend his free time reading adventure books, such as Jules Verne or Louis Stevenson. Yes, Bennett has noted that Treasure Island was his favorite book, perhaps for good reason, and it would still play a role in his life. Isabella spent all her free time, whether it was vacation or a long weekend, traveling with Lewis, and she noticed that during these expensive trips, Bennett practically forgot about work. Yes, of course, it could be reduced to the fact that all the processes in his company were so automated that he could live for himself. But nevertheless, Isabella was alarmed. She even once tried to talk to her lover on this topic, but the man either joked away or in full earnest said that he got a huge inheritance and nothing to worry about. Isabella was satisfied with such an answer. In July 2016, the couple had a joyful event. They had a daughter. For Louis, as well as for Isabella, it was the first child. The girl they named Amelia. And here the young parents began the first disagreements, which Isabella, because of the past sad experience, experienced extremely hard. They could not decide how right they should bring up their daughter. Then, in what country the daughter would be better to grow up. Louis insisted with all his might that Amelia grew up in Australia, next to his parents, and Isabella, on the contrary, did not want to go anywhere from America. Finally, the young father gave in, and in 2017, the whole family moved to Florida, where they, despite the already born daughter, decided to finally get married. Isabella begged her, now husband, to go on a honeymoon as she hoped that this sea voyage would bring them back to the state when they first got to know each other and carefree sailing around the islands on the high seas on his catamaran. Louis heard his wife's whims and promised her that there would definitely be a honeymoon, but a little later. And Louis wasn't lying. In late April 2017, he returned from Australia and the couple headed out on their romantic cruise. Yes, at first, judging by the posts on social media, everything was indeed as Isabella wanted. In all the photos, they are smiling, clasping each other in their arms and traveling around the Caribbean islands. However then, after those endless honeymoon photos, a lull began. A long one, for 2 weeks. When Isabella reappeared online, she told her family that she and her husband were in Cuba and were planning to return to Florida, but didn't know which way yet. She also added that they have a very bad connection here, so in the next few days, they may not expect a call from her. On the night of May 15th, the Coast Guard received a call for help from Louis. He said he was alone on a raft in the open sea. Rescuers immediately went in search of him. The man was found near the Bahamas, and he was indeed alone on a boat that was filled to the top with various things and provisions. On the shore, Louis told the following story. On May 14th, after a tiring day, he asked Isabella to give him a few hours of rest and, entrusting his wife with the management of the catamaran, went to take a nap in the cabin. Louis was awakened by a heavy thump from below, and he called out to his wife, but she did not respond. Then he went upstairs, looked around, and realized that Isabella was nowhere on board, and the very blow that had awakened him had created a hole in the bottom of the catamaran, through which water began to enter his vessel, and the boat began to sink. Louis decided that his wife was simply carried overboard by the blow, and since she was wearing a vest, she was fine, and in order not to go to the bottom with his child, he gathered all his belongings and moved to the rescue boat. Meanwhile, the rescuers, having taken a look at the contents of Louis's life raft, were surprised, as the man took only those things that belonged to him, as if he had no hope that his beloved Isabella was alive and would soon be found. He even brought his tea set with him. Also in his backpack were found aluminum tubes, inside which were hidden silver coins, but this discovery was not paid attention to because it was necessary to move urgently to search for Isabella. The Coast Guard used absolutely all the equipment they had, including helicopters, and surveyed the entire area, but all to no avail. But they found the very catamaran, which, according to Louis's statements, crashed on underwater rocks, but there were no underwater rocks or reefs in the vicinity. Nor had the boat itself gone completely to the bottom. It was decided to inspect the boat. For this purpose, several divers were sent to it. Again, the results of their examination did not coincide with Louis's story. As I said earlier, there were no underwater rocks at the wreck site. The boat simply could not have collided with anything, and the holes that were on the bottom were made from inside the boat, not outside. Another literally shocking oddity in this case was that the boat had all the escape hatches open, which of course increased the rate of sinking of the catamaran, and Louis mentioned in his story that he left the boat over the side, as he was supposed to. The fact is that escape hatches are strictly forbidden to be opened, and they are needed only when there is no other way to leave the sinking vessel. Also, Louis, being an experienced seafarer, did not use a beacon or satellite phone, which would have helped rescuers to find travelers in time in case of disaster. That is, from the outside, it looked as if Lewis deliberately sank the ship and made it look like an accident. But then, where is his wife? On May 17th, the search for Isabella continued, although 120 hours had passed since the catamaran wreck, while the possibility of finding a woman alive in the middle of the open sea is only 13 hours. On May 18th, the search stopped. Isabella has not been found to this day. Lewis himself returned home on May 15th, as if he wasn't really worried about missing Isabella, and what's more, he bought just one ticket to Australia for May 19th, so he didn't even hope that the rescue team would be able to find his wife, dead or alive. But he tried his best to get his wife's death certificate as soon as possible so that he could get the insurance he was entitled to as a close relative. This was denied. After the insurance company refused, Lewis visited Isabella's parents and tried to take his daughter away from them. They blamed him for Isabella's death and did not want to give Amelia away. He was able to take his daughter only after calling the police. On May 28th, he left Amelia with his parents in the UK and returned to Florida to try again to get the insurance payment, which by law was entitled to him. To the police, Lewis's behavior seemed extremely suspicious. They were literally sure that he was to blame for his wife's disappearance, but they had no evidence. Even the catamaran on which the murder could theoretically have taken place, and on which it was possible to find evidence confirming it, had gone to the bottom, to a great depth, and it was impossible to get it out of there. But the search of the house where Lewis and Isabella lived, as well as Lewis's own cell phone, proved fruitful. Yes, the fact that the husband and wife could not communicate with each other for weeks, and the husband himself could periodically disappear from home and not appear there for a long time, is not considered any evidence. But the fact that in the house were found recording devices on which Isabella recorded constant threats of her husband already pushed the investigation to the idea that not everything in their relationship was smooth. Because judging by these records, Lewis repeatedly promised to kill his wife. Isabella even told her friends about it and shared with them that she wanted to leave her fierce husband and cruel tyrant, but only try one more time, now the last, to save their relationship. But as we already know, she never succeeded. The main reason for quarrels were debts Lewis: real estate, electricity, credit cards. He literally drowned in debt, and get out of this pit, it seemed impossible. Moreover, he did not try to solve his problems, but only continued to travel on his catamaran, still did not work anywhere, and in addition spent some of the rest of his savings on such things as Thai boxing lessons in Thailand. Of course, Isabella didn't like it, and in the meantime, Lewis even forced his wife to give up child rearing and get a job so that she could pay off his debts while he was doing more important things. Looking into Lewis Bennett's debts, the investigation also found that between 2014 and 2016, the man engaged in international transfers totaling about $160,000. As it turned out, the very coins that rescuers found in Lewis's backpack were very rare and collectible. Later, the investigation will establish that the coins were stolen in 2016. One of Lewis's acquaintances, who at that time was a member of the crew of the ship Kitty, and when the crew went to town, this acquaintance stole the coins and gave them to Lewis for further resale. Yes, it was for smuggling that the investigation managed to put Lewis behind bars, because during a search of the house, in addition to those tape recordings, the police found some of the coins. For smuggling, Lewis received 7 months in prison. There, while behind bars, the man also received a second charge, just for the involuntary manslaughter of his wife. The investigation carefully checked all the facts that they had on their hands, in which they so scrupulously collected piece by piece, and came to the conclusion that during their trip, Isabella found in her husband's things those very collectible coins, and between them there was a scandal. But it was not entirely clear whether Isabella had been killed on the boat or in the water. During the quarrel, quite fiery and somewhere even cruel husband could either not calculate the force of the blow or throw the woman into the water and then do not provide her with any help. And so Isabella drowned while her husband watched her torment, being on board. During the tragedy, Lewis realized that his wife's death was a good thing for him, and if he made it look like a sinking boat accident, He would get an additional payout for the sinking catamaran in addition to the money for Isabella's death, since it was also considered an insured event. But only the whole story on the part of the prosecution was just a fantasy of the grief-stricken relatives. Lewis was never charged with premeditated murder. For lack of evidence, he was offered a deal that if he pleaded guilty, he would only get 8 years. Lewis accepted. But should he have agreed to it, if he really is not guilty, and all the evidence against him is only a tape recorder where he threatens his wife? Isabella's relatives were of course furious at this verdict, but also realized that otherwise Lewis Bennett would serve the rest of his time for the smuggling article and be released very soon. In November 2018, Lewis Bennett received 8 years in prison, and all of the insurance payments and all of his wife's assets, which he had claimed, and for which he had arranged all of this, will go to Amelia. Also, the court ordered Lewis to pay monetary compensation to his daughter, who has yet to experience such serious psychological trauma as she grows up.